Hi, Misha here, and we've done a big video on, of course, the AKs last summer, and then per Patreon vote, the FNFAL L1A1 in December, and now as we round out February, another one that was in the Patreon poll, the big Armalite Colt AR10 AR15 video. So we're going to dive in. We're primarily going to focus on the various U.S. service models running through what's considered 4 generations, unofficially. So we're not going to get into much of the foreign thing, but there's going to be some surprises, some things that aren't on the couch currently. And as with the previous ones, this is more of an overview, general video, not really too deeply detailed. If you like that, check out some of the previous videos I've done where I dive into more numbers and things like that and anecdotes. This is just me chatting about a gun. So, if you could like, share, subscribe, and comment below. It's always fun to chat. Or check out Patreon, because most of these larger videos or more off-the-wall videos are directly because of Patreon support. So with that, this story begins with Armalite. And AR10, AR15 stands for Armalite rifle. As I'm sure you know, but some may not. No, it does not stand for assault rifle or anything else. We have to talk about the original Armalite company. And this was its first truly commercially successful product, the AR7 survival rifle, explorer, takedown rifle, what have you. But 7 denotes 7th model, 7th version. It was actually inspired by this, the H&R M4, and also the subsequent M6 over-under. Survival guns for aircraft crew. So, October 1st, 1954, George Sullivan officially founds Armalite, which was the light arms, small arms division under Fairchild. And Sullivan had also had associations with Lockheed. So you get it. He's part of the aircraft industry. This is very important. The old M4 and M6, while relatively compact, at just over a foot, fully collapsed in, these are made by steel. And stamping, yes, but steel. So they weighed roughly 4 pounds. Not exactly light for a bolt action firing .22 Hornet. But the aircraft industry focused on very advanced materials for strength and lightweight. Fiberglass, nylons, carbon fibers, so on and so forth. And that was the goal with Armalite. Let's use the aircraft industry's advancements in firearms. And it was always meant to be an idea, a development, a design area with a very small machine shop for prototypes and concepts. And funnily enough, it was founded in Hollywood, California. So not just California, which is funny enough to us today, but Hollywood. Yeah, different times, guys. Different times, 1954. It was still kind of the Wild West out there. And it was a very, very small outfit. Not even half a dozen employees when it first got going. In fact, it didn't even start with Eugene Stoner. But it would soon. As Sullivan was working on a potential replacement for the M4 and M6, because the Air Force was going to have trials for a new survival gun to go in the new B-70, XB-70 bomber, as it would happen, which would never go into full production. He thought he could make something new and better, and he was correct. And he was testing a prototype when he met Eugene Stoner, who himself had been tinkering in his spare time with various concepts. He was a Marine and had served, and so he gets invited to be the chief design engineer at Armalite, and also works alongside someone that I have personal admiration for, Melvin Johnson of 1941 Johnson fame. So those are 3 of the employees. And even by 1956, as it's oft reported, only 9 employees were officially at Armalite. And their first real design concepts came out in 1955. The AR-1 Para Sniper. It was in the very new 7.62x51 NATO cartridge, and it didn't go much of anywhere. But it was kind of Eugene Stoner's first effort on Armalite's behalf, and it would directly lead to the AR-5, this gun's bolt-action immediate predecessor. Now, the original Harrington and Richardson M4 had a retracting stock, as you see here, a very basic pistol grip. It was a bolt action, and it was magazine fed, holding 4 rounds of .22 Hornet, and the barrel could be detached. This was meant to be a survival gun. The somewhat later M6, the M4 was adopted in 1949, by the way. The M6 around 1952 was similar, but it had an over-under arrangement with a .22 Hornet and a .410 barrel, so it was a single shot, double barrel, and instead of being mag-fed, and it was still a bolt action, and it had provisions to store additional shells and rounds in the stock, which is different. So those were the 2 survival guns that the military had. But around 55, they were wanting to have trials for something newer and better, and that's where Armalite steps in. They offer their AR-5, a magazine-fed bolt-action gun, still firing .22 Hornet, and still able to be compacted down to just over a foot to fit in the survival kit. So what made it better? Weight. The M4 and M6 were nearly 4 pounds in their stowed condition. The AR-5, in a similar condition, would be just over 2.5 pounds. 1.5 pounds really matters, and that was thanks to the new materials that Armalite was employing. They had a synthetic lined barrel, carbon fiber barrel with a steel liner. Now, this is my Israeli version, so it doesn't have the stock, but it was a fiberglass foam-filled stock, which not only was much lighter and could store things inside, it also could float, which is just cool. So a lot more useful. Again, this was all steel stampings and whatnot. And the AR-5 was successful. It was officially adopted as the MA-1. And it was started to be ordered, but because of the failure of the XB-70 and the fact that the Air Force had so many M4s and M6s and just changing attitudes in 1956, very few MA-1s made it into the military. So it looked like the AR-5, even though it was successful, was still going to be a failure. Unfortunately, we start to see this a lot for Armalite. Innovative design. But they forged ahead, basing the AR-7 here on the AR-5. Instead of firing .22 Hornet, it fires .22 long rifle, although it does need rather high-powered / high-velocity rounds, and it was a semi-automatic versus mag-fed. Again, the original version has a fixed stock that it can be collapsed into. This one's a little different, and this one also has a shortened barrel with an extension put on. This was introduced, the AR-7, in 1959 to the market, and was the first commercially successful product. It was marketed towards hunters, survivalists, backpackers, and, any military who might want them, and that's kind of where the Israeli gun here comes from. The Israelis did purchase quite a order from Armalite in the 60s, and they modified them with an FAL pistol grip, and they took the floating stock off and added this retractable wire stock, and to store extra cartridges, they actually put them in the pistol grip. They also use this K98 front sight, lob the barrel down to 13.5 inches. You get the deal. We've talked about it before. It is a cool gun, though, and the Israelis would use these in their aircraft for decades. And I should point out that both of these guns plus the M6 besides, were never intended for combat. They were never intended for going against humans. They were always up against wild game as a survival gun if you needed to kill wild game for nutrients, or if you maybe were down in an area where you were being attacked by wolves or something. That was the whole nature of this concept. As it would happen, the U.S. Air Force really wouldn't get a new survival gun, at least rifle, for a very long time, but we'll eventually get there in this video. So this was the origins of Armalite, from the beginning of George Sullivan wanting a survival gun, meeting Stoner, getting his input, developing the AR5 and the AR7. But what about the AR1 and what that would lead to? Because, again, they're an idea firm, and they had many, many ideas with Johnson, Stoner, Sullivan, and others. Yeah, they were not in short supply. Now we can begin talking about Armalite's AR10. Now this is the really third production version, the so-called NATO model or Portuguese model. So we'll have to kind of imagine, as we go back to 1955, Eugene Stoner, after the AR-1 didn't go much of anywhere, had worked on a couple of different prototypes, going over to semi-auto select fire rifles, because that was the new thing. The FAL was getting quite popular, SETME was advancing their design, and of course work was underway in the U.S. government, U.S. military at the Springfield Arsenal as well. Armory, sorry. So this is kind of the new thing. And it was actually based on what we could kind of loosely call the AR-4, the Model 4, that the prototype for the AR-10 would be developed by 1956. And this used the new fiberglass type furniture, composite, alloy receivers, and rather famously, because of George Sullivan's insistence, even though Stoner objected, they kept the two-piece barrel from the AR-5 and later AR-7 with the steel liner and then the carbon fiber outer thing. It did keep the gun light. It was under 7 pounds. That's very light for a semi-automatic magazine-fed 308. And they would build a couple of prototypes, and when I say build, I mean like handcraft them at Hollywood and give these to Springfield for testing by the end of 1956. And a couple more would be given the next year, so they had a couple, but these are just hand-built guns at Hollywood. And as you know, the barrel burst during a test. There's different things back and forth. Either way, from the beginning, the AR-10, a very new design with very new technology, never stood a chance. From the outset, Springfield's own T-44, later to become the M14, was adopted in 1957. This is a very conventional design. As you see, overall length is about the same, but the M14, much heavier, no pistol grip, you know the deal. Heavier steel mags, still 20 rounds, versus the alloy mags of the AR-10 platform, although early on there were different capacities as well. This gun had been in development. For one thing, it's based on the M1 Garand, not as much as Springfield would like us to believe, but it was. And it had been in development for several years. And of course, it was up against the T-48, Harrington and Richardson license produced, also high standard for that matter, produced variant of the FAL, very loosely associated with the original Type A. So that was it. The T-48 and the T-44 were really the finalists. There was also a T-47, anyway, and this was a very late comer from a tiny factory, and it never stood a chance. In fact, Hollywood would build fewer than 60 guns. But again, these were samples. These were prototypes. And in July of 1957, they would have some success and some hope, despite the pretty expected failure with the M14 here. That summer, a 5-year contract was signed with a Dutch factory, artillery enriched, which I will butcher, and I will just say AI from now on. Either way, large factory in the Netherlands was to produce, under license, Armalite's AR10, because they expected military orders. They also started associating with Sam Cummings. We talked about him in the M1 Grand video recently. Yeah, he pops up a lot. He was not an employee of Armalite, but he was an associate and an international sales rep for them. And he was a good salesman, I'll give him that. Just not really for the AR-10. Anyway, they tooled up there, and they were hopeful. And they did get a good order in 1958 from Sudan. That version was quite similar to what had been made in Hollywood, except they went to a steel barrel. It was fluted, 20 inches, and it was probably the first time a bayonet lug had been tossed on one. Had the original style handguards. Still had the style charging handle, but even more basic than this. It's cool, but they would make 2,500 for Sudan, the first major contract. And they were all set for a large Guatemalan order if the gun would pass testing and trials. Unfortunately, during testing, a bolt lug sheared off, and, well, that was it for that whole idea. And a few other contracts fell away as well. For one, Cuba. In 1958, Batista ordered 100 sample guns, and these would actually be delivered in December of 1958. But by that time, Fidel Castro was coming in. And believe it or not, even though he was a communist, he actually did not stiff Cummings on the bill. He paid for the 100 AI-built AR-10s. And he wanted more, but politics, communism, it didn't happen. Therefore, he didn't have enough to equip his army, and so they kind of got sold to guerrillas and whatnot in South America throughout the 60s and would pop up here and there. And these Cuban models are often called transitional models, as they had some product improvements based on service in Sudan and trials and whatnot. And so they're a halfway point between that and this one here, which is a Portuguese paratrooper Air Force version. The so-called NATO version, which was introduced by AI in 1960. Fun fact, Hollywood in the US, the production there at Armalite, really didn't adopt the changes that AI was introducing, first with the Sudanese, then the Cuban, and then finally the Portuguese. I don't know why. I think they were already moving along, though, if we're being honest with each other. But yeah, this is the version that probably saw the most use and production. But even that was considered disappointing by Fairchild, Armalite's still parent company at the time. AI's NATO improved model had several improvements, including a 3-way selector. Yes, YouTube, this is just 2-way, don't worry. It also, while it still had the trigger style handle, it could be pressed in now to be used as a forward assist or a bolt closure device, as Europeans style it. So you can tell Stoner wasn't involved there. It also had a simplified and stronger gas regulator for launching grenades, and improved furniture, stronger bolt lugs, you can kind of guess why after the failure of that one contract, and a better, stronger extractor. It also had a new pattern of flash hider, still a 3-port. Interestingly, the bottom is open and the top is closed. The original style was so-called beer can flash hider, if it had one at all. And then you had the 3-prong open style, like on the Sudanese, and now you have the enclosed style. This was done to keep it from snagging and also to keep the prongs from bending. And then, interestingly, we have a bayonet lug mounted on the top of the barrel instead of bottom, more of a G3 set-me style. And here is a bayonet. My scabbard hanger is a little tatty, but that's alright. Here's the bayonet on top. Very unique for what it is. And the reason this kit shows wear and tear is because it saw actual service, because this model was tested in 1960 by the Portuguese, and they adopted it as the M961, and they intended to purchase enough to pretty much equip their entire armed forces. But as it happens, hope turned to disappointment yet again. By the way, here's the late style AR10 original magazine. Notice the waffle pattern. This is very lightweight alloy. We had a bolt hold open device, of course, and we have drop free mags. I just can't show you because of YouTube, but I wanted to point out mags. Typically, these would be issued with 4 mags per gun, although a standard NATO mag pouch would actually hold 5. The gun itself actually did well, though. The Aberdeen Proving Grounds tested a couple of these in November of 1960, and unlike earlier experiences from 1957, this time they found the AI-built NATO edition AR-10 to be accurate, dependable, durable, and reliable. Pretty good marks, but the U.S. was not in the market for a new 7.62 NATO battle rifle at the time. They were just testing it. So the gun itself really worked out well, and the Portuguese liked it too. They found it to be dependable, accurate. In fact, some were fitted with a 3-power optic and used as a de facto DMR. And they were even used to launch rifle grenades. A lot. 1961 started off well for AI in Portugal. The first few batches were delivered, several thousands. But then politics changed. The Dutch government put pretty severe export restrictions on military hardware. And also, Portugal was not fully sanctioned or embargoed, but was falling out of favor because of decolonizational actions in Africa and elsewhere. So exporting arms to Portugal wasn't really politically what the Netherlands were up to. So in the end, only a few thousand were delivered, not enough for the entire Portuguese army. Therefore, they ended up getting assigned to the Paratrooper Corps, who really liked them and used them in Africa. And the guns actually proved to be a heck of a lot more durable than you would think, except for maybe the stock. Because they did use them to launch rifle grenades or hit things. You'll find some of the Portuguese M961 AR-10s with wood or even metal stocks. So, yeah, but they did serve for decades. In fact, there are still pictures of them in use in the mid-70s during the decolonizational thing in the Timor area. So it doesn't seem like they were actually fully replaced until the 1980s. So the few they had lasted a long time. Incidentally, they were replaced by the HK-G3 with the telescoping stock. What else? In truth, that was it. Like I said, 1961 wasn't a good year, so the whole thing got shut down. The AI factory just decided, you know what, we're getting out of small arms manufacturing altogether. We're going to make other things. I don't know, light bulbs. That's okay, because Fairchild, not really happy with how things had gone, was not going to renew their contract. Remember, I said it was for 5 years initially, so either way, by 1962, it was all over. How many did AI build? No one knows, but under probably 10,000 total, with 5,000 or fewer being of the NATO version here. And again, we had 2,500 Sudanese, meaning, outstanding about 2,500 else transitional and other versions. There was even a carbine version built in small numbers, a few dozen, with a 16-inch barrel, but didn't really get adopted. That was kind of it. That was the end of the AR-10. And things actually even get worse. The guns, when they were surplused, a lot of them would go to England, Canada, Australia, and of course the US too. But several thousand were actually destroyed in the 90s in Australia during changing times. And of course the ones that went to England would become DWATs. So fewer than 10,000 made, many thousands were lost in military use, and thousands more lost to government buyback programs, meaning there just aren't that many parts kits or registered automatics in the world today. And the AR-10 of the 1950s and 60s is not the AR-10 you might think of. The AR-10 you might think of is more like the AR-15, which we're about to get to. Going back to Hollywood real quick, while the Armalite factory would never really go to the AI patterns, they did have a slightly product improved version that they tried marketing as the AR-10A in the late 50s. Outside of a few tool room prototypes, it didn't go anywhere. However, you are familiar with its little brother. So now it's time to get into the main attraction of this video. My SP1 is my earliest pattern AR, but compared to where it began, this is relatively late. It actually dates back all the way to 1957, spring of that year, when the Continental Army Command, CONARC, expressed an interest in a small diameter, so relatively small bore, high velocity cartridge and rifle to go along with it. Kind of looking to replace submachine guns and really the old M1/M2/M3 carbine. Not as a frontline battle gun, of course, because the M14 is just about to be adopted, but this actually piques the interest of Eugene Stoner and Armalite, so work begins on scaling down the AR-10, again firing 7.62 NATO, to fire a 22 caliber projectile. And they begin with 222 Remington. And in March 1958, the earliest pretty much hand-built concept guns are sent for evaluation. These would have the designation of XAR1501. Yeah, I know. And they would go from this pure 222 Remington to 222 Special using the new DuPont IMR powder, and the whole idea was to get a little more oomph so it could penetrate a steel helmet at distance. And this would quickly be reclassified to 223 Remington, essentially what we know and love today. So that's how the cartridge developed. As for the earliest guns, they still had the trigger style charging handle. They had a round style for handguard, not with the metal and polymer, just polymer. And they could either have no flash hider or an early style flash hider. Nothing was really set in stone. And earliest evaluations were pretty good, but the board suggested some product improvements, which I guess is one of the benefits of having a pretty much handcrafted gun shop, workshop. You can just go back and change. For example, early on, the triangle pattern handguards were introduced to the design. Also, very early on, the trigger charging handle was removed and replaced with the rear-mounted one, but not the style we know and love today, but a very small, still kind of triangular shaped one, and that would continue on for a bit. And you would see the early style three-prong flash hiders appear, and the barrels would go from being fluted, as on some of the AR-10s, to just a straight side, effectively making them heavier, although still very much a pencil profile. And of course, back then, they were 1 in 14 twists, and as far as I know, they were all made by Winchester as a contractor. And so that would progress forward. But at this time, 1959, Armalite's not really targeting America. There's no open orders, there's no trials. You know, CONARC had just expressed an interest, which kind of spurred this on, and they had received relatively positive endorsements. But Armalite was an idea company, an idea firm for Fairchild, so they wanted to sell the design. So in 1959, negotiations were underway with Colt, and they would primarily focus on purchasing Eugene Stoner's direct impingement, or if you prefer, internal gas piston system. But I want to just briefly mention the contribution from Melvin Johnson, the multi-lug rotating bolt system. If you look at a 1941, you see it all the way back then. And we also have to credit Sullivan for bringing over his knowledge from the aircraft industry, mostly to do with the materials, the alloys, the fiberglasses, if not the two-piece barrel. Obviously, by this point, we're having a steel barrel. So those three, plus another half a dozen folks working in Armalite, were credited with everything. But the AR-10 and the AR-15 design were being transferred over to Colt, who would officially begin manufacturing under their agreement with Armalite, which they would receive a Armalite/Fairchild, but get some royalties from in December of 1959. In 59, Armalite/Colt was really focusing on export foreign customers. The U.S. just really wasn't interested. Like I said, the Army really didn't like the early AR's performance in the Arctic, in rain, yada yada. You know probably more about it than I do, but testing, they dropped it. This would bring in Robert McDonnell, and he kind of toured Asia, Southeast Asia to be really specific, showing off the AR-10, AR-15, at which time Colt was tooling up not to make the AR-15 really, but to make the AR-10A at their factory as production would be switching over. But once he got to Asia, he noticed that everyone was looking at the new gun with very little interest in the older design. Probably because proliferation had happened and the FAL, the G3, so on and so forth, were already there. So McDonnell wrote back to Colt and said, hey, you should switch over to the AR-15. So they did. And McDonnell had some limited success this year. He sold a small batch to Malaysia and a small batch to India. And other nations wanted to evaluate as well. Thus, December, Colt had the first batch of 300 so-called Model 01, later 601, we'd call them, guns released. And we're getting closer to what we have here. One change Colt made, the Armalite gun had a 25-round mag. Colt would go to a 20-rounder with the waffly pattern like up here. Also, they would go to the three-prong hider that had been experimented with. The handguards. Now, the gas block on the early guns was cast. That's actually kind of important. No forward assist, of course. Slab side design with a removable front pin. Solid body stock with a rubber butt plate. Some of the early guns could have the kind of naturally brownish color. The vast majority of 01s had their furniture painted green. Different shades, but different greens. Some late guns are reported with black furniture paint, but this could just be a retrofit thing. In truth, the Colt 01, still with the 1 in 14 twist, was built for quite a long time, with production not ending until early 1963. No one knows for sure how many they built, but 14,500 is a number I see from time to time. So that they did build these. And the U.S. military would kind of get back involved. It was Robert McDonnell, with connections and favors owed, that got himself invited to General Curtis LeMay's birthday party in 1960, where he took some early 601s or 01s, and they shot watermelons with them. And this actually impressed the Air Force chief, who was really needing something to replace his aging M2 carbines. So he requested in July of 1960 that the Air Force purchase, and basically the Army stepped in and said no, because at this time, essentially, the Army controlled the purchasing for the Air Force, and the Navy kind of controlled the Marines, yada yada. I know I'm simplifying. It was rejected. This is, keep in mind, during the Eisenhower administration. Later on that year, he proposed again and was roundly rejected a second time. But third tries the charm, I suppose, because in 1962, thanks to Robert McNamara, his request was finally approved. The Air Force could purchase the Colt 01. I think ARPA had a lot to do with this because by this point they're expressing interest in the gun. In fact, they acquire a couple of thousand. Project Agile gets kicked off, and instead of giving old World War II guns to Southeast Asian allies, namely, of course, South Vietnam, we'll give them this new gun. It's felt that it's relatively small size, lightweight, but good penetration would be perfect for the jungle and perfect for the stature and body type of those soldiers. Makes sense. And this would become quite a famous program and really ramp things up. And the Air Force would get their first guns, and several would go over there over time. And this would lead to the Model 02. Introduced in 1963, the Model 02 would go to the 1 in 12 twist to try to assuage some of the concerns about use in the Arctic and other cold environments. There would be a few other changes, namely, we would go away from the little charging handle to the large one eventually, and we would go away from the waffle mag to the slab side, although this really wasn't in effect until the Model 03, the 603. There's a bit of overlap there if we're being completely honest. But yeah, the barrel twist is the main deal. And the whole reason that the Army acquiesced, well, there's a few things. First, President Kennedy got involved. I've read different sources claiming just how much direct experience he had with the AR, but he certainly wasn't against it. He did handle them at least a bit in the spring of '63. And in November, the first official purchase order of 85,000 would be received by Colt. Now, this was meant to be an interim solution, a one-time purchase, because they had this newfangled idea. Now, the M14 had been shit-canned in 1963. It wasn't working out even before Vietnam. The current orders would be allowed to run out, but no new orders would be put in, thus why its production was over by '65. Instead, the SPIW, the SPIW, was meant to be the next big leap forward, but they knew it would not be ready for a few more years. So Colt's AR-15, Armalite's AR-15, was to be the stopgap. And this is where the whole XM16 designation comes from with the Model 02, which very quickly transitioned over to the Model 03 here, which just had a few more product improvements that the Army insisted on. For one, that gas block. The original cast one had to be replaced with a forged one. For another, by the time we get to the 603, that front pin, which was just retained with the detent, well, we go to the captive pin we know and love today. This is the partial fence, or E1 type lower. Like I said, we would go to the charging handle we know. The buttstocks would change. We had the type A, B, C. Eventually we get to the type D. Pistol grips would change. Like I said, the mags would change. Early ones with the slab side would have the kind of silvery finish. Lots of the control parts would change. Not enough time in this video. Yeah, I know, funny for that. But it goes to show you there were some incremental changes from 02 to 03. The 02 was nominally a commercial gun, but in reality, the vast majority, if not all, went to government/military operators, really meaning that the Model 01 was the only one that was available for, say, law enforcement, and even for export, at least early on. The 02 and 03 were there. And of course, there was also another change with the 03 that is rather famous and infamous, which gets us to the 604. The infamous forward assist, teardrop style. Yes, Stoner didn't like it. Yes, it was put in because the Army insisted, and it would lead to kind of the split. 603, XM16E1 has it, 602, and 604 do not. These are XM16s. So E1 means it's there. Otherwise, the guns were pretty well the same. Of course, we introduced the partial fence, which this is a full fence, but partial fence lower for the captive front pin with the 604. This would come later. Yes. And there's lots of other changes besides, including to the magazines. Later style would have a finish to them more so. Still 20 rounds, which would stay the standard for a very long time. 1 in 12 twist, pencil barrel. So basically, we have the Air Force getting roughly 19,000. The Army picks up 85,000. Now these would be shared with the Marine Corps as well. So original purchase order, a little over 100,000, beginning in the end of 1963. And of course, this would be right in time for the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the summer of '64, and the Vietnam War. And that's a whole thing in and of itself. In '64, really only Special Forces, maybe some of the Air Force Guards and things had the new XM16, XM16E1. But already by 1965, they were going into theater in ever-increasing numbers, including with the U.S. Marines. In fact, that year, the Secretary of Defense authorized it for use in all branches. And contrary to the original idea at the end of '63 as a one-time purchase, in 1965, an order for 100,000 more was placed, and then in '66, another 100,000 more. Yeah, the SPIW, the SPEW, I don't know, obviously didn't really go much of anywhere. But of course, between '64 and '67, we had lots of parts transitions, and the biggest ones had to do with the reports of jams, malfunctions, failures to extract, stuck casings, all that good stuff. Did the forward assist help, hurt, or do nothing? Well, hey. What we do know is the switch from IMR, improved military rifle powder, stick powder, to more traditional ball powder. While it did give a little more oomph, more velocity, it burned faster. It meant that with the Edgewater buffer, like in this one, gave it a higher cyclic rate, which put higher wear and tear on parts, and it also made the gun dirtier faster. And this, of course, was made worse because Colt's marketing department said that this gun was self-cleaning. Yeah, so let's put dirtier ammunition in it that it wasn't made to use in the first place, and then say, hey, you don't worry about cleaning it. Oh, and let's send it to Southeast Asia. In the M16 AR-15's defense, this was the only time in U.S. history that a military arm was taken essentially directly from the drawing board to combat. In the past, like with the M1 Grand, it had a decade of development and then a few years of peacetime service stateside to kind of iron out the major kinks. Think about it. What if the original gas trap Grand had been the standard service gun in 1942? But luckily, since it had been around since 1936 and been in development since 1926, they had time to realize, hey, the Bang system, the gas trap system, kind of sucks. So it's not surprising that they would find some things to change with the AR. There was a congressional hearing. Things got rough for a minute, but Colt responded very quickly. First and foremost, they immediately issued cleaning kits, cleaning guides, and told people to clean them. They also replaced the Edgewater buffer with the buffer we know and love today as a standard rifle. And they would go from an all chrome plated bolt group to first a phosphated bolt carrier and chromed bolt head, and then eventually all phosphate. We would go to an improved firing pin. Actually, there were a couple of different steps up there, and so on and so forth. We would also change up the gas tube, going from carbon steel to stainless steel, and eventually changing the bend in it. And we would add drain holes to the front sight base, the buttstock screw. Like I said, we would go from the partial fence to the full fence. Yeah, it's a thing. And all these transitions kind of took place with the XM16E1, the Colt 603, and subsequent 604. And one of the final changes they made was a chrome-plated chamber. Not bore, just chamber. Some of the Dutch AI-built AR10s, the later ones, did have a chrome chamber. So just thought I'd point that out since I didn't mention it earlier. So they do that here to help extraction and cleaning. But the technology, I guess, wasn't really there at the time to chrome-plate a 22 caliber bore for mass production on a budget, because military guns. Another later change would be a switch from the prong flash hider to the birdcage closed-in flash hider. And eventually these were type classified in February of 1967, going from the XM16E1 to the M16A1. And that would be really where things would improve for the gun. Training was better, familiarity was better, and even the magazines were built to a better standard. But there were still a few more changes to come. In 1970, a fully chromed bore would be introduced, and one of the later changes would be the trapdoor in the buttstock. Even though we think of this as an A1 stock, truth is, for a couple of years, they still use the Type D E1 stock with a solid butt plate. They made a few of the changes, like the sling swivel became fixed. They went from a roll-pinned front swivel to one held in with a rivet. They quit machining down the flashing on the front sight base gas block because, just took up time and energy. So on and so forth. And of course, in 1968, GM Hydromatic and H&R were contracted to make M16A1s for the U.S. government, because by this time, it was the standard with hundreds of thousands of service. And the truth is, soldiers serving in Vietnam, when they were surveyed at this time, by and large approved, especially over the M14. The M14, of course, maybe would have been a great rifle for Korea, but wasn't really the rifle for Vietnam. And from that point onward, that's kind of the standard, the M16A1. The 20-round mag would remain. Yes, Colt would first introduce a 30 in 1969, but it would take the better part of a decade for really any to get into military hands, and very few made their way over to Vietnam before the war was over, especially the ground war. So we see these here. This has the seatbelt sling. This has the earlier style. Let's look at a little bit of kit. Here are a couple of mag pouches. Because the M16 wasn't really planned for, early on they carried 4 mags in a M56 pouch. But it's a little too tall, so stuff some socks in the bottom. Later on, they would actually introduce a dedicated pouch that was shorter and made them more of a nylon material versus cotton canvas for obvious reasons, Vietnam. And those were the kind of basic styles we saw there. From the beginning, the Colt 601 had a bayonet lug. Colt contracted or made the earliest bayonets, but soon we would go to the official government M7 here, which would serve for decades. This was based on the previous M6 for the M14, which itself was derived from really the M3 fighting knife of World War II, which was upgraded to fit on the M1 carbine. It's all kind of connected if you think about it. No real fancy wire cutters here, just a straightforward stabby pokey thing. As mentioned early on, Colt issued these with cleaning kits after the initial problems. And they also issued them with a bayonet and a bipod. So combine the bipod with the cleaning kit storage here, because again we have a solid body buttstock. Now after the A1 style was introduced in the 70s, we would get a second pattern of hanger for the bipod. This one's actually Korean, but I've got a US one too, without the compartment for the cleaning kit. Yeah, these were kind of Vietnam style here. And the whole idea of a bipod for the M16, well, it was to make it the squad gunner. Your average rifleman was meant to keep his gun on single shot mode, but the support guy, the machine gunner in the squad, was meant to keep his on automatic, or at least use it, and install this bipod. Made of metal stampings, simple, lightweight, unadjustable, clamping right onto the barrel. It was there. It was a thing. It did give some stability. It wasn't exactly loose, and it was inspiring other nations to create. In fact, the Polish Tantal's bipod is directly inspired by this. Not exactly the best solution, especially with just the 20-round mags. And this actually left the door open for the M14 to come back with the M14E2 becoming the M14A1, which was sometimes the light machine gun element firing 7.62. That's a story for another day, but I think the bipod is a cool accessory. But since it will scuff your barrel up, that's why I didn't put it on the SP1, put it on my A1 build here. So yeah, bayonet, extra mags, usually 4 to a pouch, bipod, sling, cleaning kit comic manual. That's what was issued in the late 60s. And as far as the M16 rifle, M16A1, and the Air Force's M16 604, after this rapid period of development, you would stay pretty much unchanged throughout the 70s, including its 1 in 12 twist and its 55 grain 223, still known at that time by this, although very soon the 5.56 NATO metric designation would appear too, as this would spread to other nations. I could say more, and we've gone even more in depth in other videos, but hope that's at least a good primer. And of course, this is a refurbished gun. That's why it's more in a black color. Originally, it would have been in the charcoal gray to lighter gray. Actually, Colt used several different styles of gray over the years. They also would change the type of polymer used in the handguards and buttstock, going from more of a marbly style to a shiny style to more of this matte style. Again, lots of changes. But then, after that, not many. The first set are all quote-unquote rifles, be it 7.62 or 223, 20-inch barrel. And there aren't many parts kits today for AR10s, originals. This is, like I said, a Portuguese, so it's a later style, but I'm just happy to have anything. A Sudanese would also be cool. My SP1 I've talked about ad nauseum. It's an early one. I went for that because I like the slab side look. All SP1s were slab side. They made well over 300,000, with production not ending until the 80s. There was also a carbine version. However, it's also a slab side, and there really wasn't a carbine slab side. Not in production anyway. And of course, the A1 is my old build that I put together a long time ago, and it's gone through several updates and iterations. It's my shooter out of the group, and really do enjoy it. But I did a video last year on the Brownells BRN XM16E1. It's one of those guns, many times I've wanted to keep one, but then I just realized that there aren't that many differences between my SP1 and my A1 build. Not enough to warrant keeping a gun that's well over $1,000 today. That's kind of the problem, and why I don't have every variant or even close to it, and probably never really will want, because you can go mad doing that, and the differences become more and more slight. Of course, if money were an unlimited resource, absolutely. In fact, that's a good segue into our next category, our next group of firearms. Between 63 and 68, Colt perfected the M16, originally Armalite's AR15. And, we haven't thought about Armalite in a minute. what have they been up to in the meanwhile? Well, this, of course, the AR-18, or rather the AR-180. Well, sort of in a roundabout manner. 1959, yes, they work on selling the design for the AR-10, AR-15 to Colt. Specifically, what they sold Colt was Eugene Stoner's gas system. Not just the gas tube, but the bolt carrier group itself, because part of that whole internal piston thing, the gas actually enters the key going in. That's why you have the gas rings. So, in some ways, according to Stoner anyway, the bolt itself is part of the piston system versus a true direct impingement like on, say, the Swedish AG42 or the French MAS49. Either way, that's what was sold. That's what was key to the design. And they also sold Eugene Stoner to Colt. Okay, not really. Stoner would remain working at Armalite, and what Sullivan wanted to do next was kind of court the emerging third world. At that time, third world wasn't a derogatory term. Far from it. Places like Yugoslavia, India used it as a point of pride to say we're not the West, the East, we're not capitalists, we're communists, we're the in-between, we're the other. They were basically the libertarians of their day. But they were also developing nations, at least a large number of them. So the idea was, let's make a firearm for them. So it needed to be constructible with simplistic tooling and more standard methods. So get rid of the forged aluminum. Let's go to stampings, sheet steel, simple spot welding. We can't use the Stoner gas system, so let's go to a traditional short stroke gas piston. Yeah, it kind of cracks me up that in the last few decades, people act like a gas piston's this new great invention for the AR platform. I'm not saying it's bad, but the truth is, short stroke pistons have been around for decades. So going back to a short stroke piston was in some ways a reversal. Now, they were able to use the 7-lug rotating bolt, originally made by Melvin Johnson back in the 30s. But again, the gas system and all that is different because a gas piston taps the square carrier, and the carrier would actually ride within rails. Now, you would think they would make this new gun, again, Stoner's working on it, for 5.56, 223, the new cartridge. But no, their thought was an emerging nation would stick to a standard cartridge, thus 7.62 NATO. Therefore, 1960, the AR-16 was born, chambered for that cartridge, and essentially being an upscaled version of this, including folding stock and whatnot. It had the sheet steel receiver and gas piston system. And no one was really interested because, well, Armalite had miscalculated. There wasn't really a market for it. And for various reasons, Stoner would leave the company, eventually becoming a close partner with Colt. But he was out by 1961. So Armalite loses Stoner, and he's basically replaced by Arthur Miller, at least as chief designer, engineer, what have you. So the next step, let's downsize the AR-16 to fire 223, much as they had downsized the AR-10 into the AR-15. By 1962, this project was underway, which actually means Stoner himself never worked on what will be known soon as the AR-18 for the select fire version. What was the AR-17? It was actually a two-shot shotgun. And they would make about 1,000 of them over time. Not a huge number, but yeah. Oh, one other thing I should also mention. In 1959, because of logistical things, Armalite would move from its original Hollywood location to Costa Mesa, still in California, but it was felt to be a better area for production. And it does seem like they were able to increase their production slightly, able to make guns in the hundreds instead of dozens, but still, it was a very small shop. Still, they were meant to be an idea company. Speaking of that, Fairchild. After more misses than hits, okay, they had some luck with the AR-10, AR-15 to Colt. The AR-5, the MA1, really wasn't their fault, and the AR-7 was a modest success. But Fairchild was just kind of done with it. So about the same time that they were splitting ways with AI in the Netherlands, Fairchild decided it was going to cut the Armalite subdivision loose. So in 1962, George Sullivan gathered investors and funds and essentially purchased the company himself. So we have essentially meet the new boss, same as the old boss, but it's now no longer under Fairchild, which also means it doesn't have their funding and backing. Nevertheless, the AR-18 progressed throughout 1963, and by 1964, a couple of hand-assembled prototypes were ready and were sent to Aberdeen for testing. Now, the Army did have some decent things to say about the AR-18. One very, very big feature that Armalite pushed and the Army agreed was its folding shoulder stock here. This is something obviously an AR-15 cannot do. And I could not do single-handed without it folding back. Yeah, but it folds over. Whereas, of course, on an AR of that era, this has your recoil system. This also required an ambidextrous selector. It had an 18 rather than a 20-inch barrel, still a 1 in 12 twist. Non-chrome lined bore or chamber, but keep in mind the AR at the day didn't either. It had the same bayonet lug, so it could take the M7. Very simple, basic furniture. The receiver was upper and lower, and made from stampings. Short stroke gas piston. Interestingly, the bolt actually rode on 2 guide rods instead of rails. At least I think that's kind of interesting. And the magazines were similar, but not interchangeable. So here's the AR mag with the hole on this side. Notice the over insertion. Here is the AR-18. Notice no over insertion in a much smaller slot. That's because the mag catches, this here, versus being on the other side for the AR, are very different. Some say this was a patent thing. That could be. I'll be honest, I don't know. What I will say is this is a simplified mag catch. This is a simple pivot with a spring. This is actually a 3-piece, 2 if you count the 2 that are movable. So this catch versus this catch, this is much more simple, although the AR-15 is better. This does have a last round HUD open, and it does have a dust cover here, and a reciprocating charging handle, adjustable sights. One interesting feature the AR-18, AR-180 had, though, it had this dovetail mount style thing welded to the top for a scope. Pretty advanced for that day and time. You could put a scope on an AR in this hole here on the handle, but it's pretty high. It's a little more elegant. So what happened? Despite a couple of positives, what the Army found was there were some pretty major weak spots. For example, the bracket that holds the stock on, it's just welded on. It's quite vulnerable. The way it folds, just squeezing in these, is quite weak. The last round hole open, that catch is very weak. I can attest to that firsthand. I will also say the trigger on these is not great because it's made with stamped components and castings versus any type of forgings. I've seen people try to improve the trigger on an AR-180 and end up just completely butchering it. And the magazine. They found that this gun had a very high rate of fire. I'm wondering if they were using IMR powder or ball powder ammo. By the way, they found that it had a high rate of fire, so much so that the bolt would overrun the magazine and feeding would jam up. and just a few other things besides. Plus, of course, by 1964, they had already purchased their first major order of AR-15s from Colt, and that was the direction they were going. Nevertheless, Armalite and Costa Mesa would continue developing the design and hoping to get foreign buyers. In a bit of foreshadowing, one interested customer was the British SAS, and I believe also the SBS had some. They liked some things, but they also found some deficiencies. Armalite would make a few changes between 65 and 67, namely improving the magazine feed a bit. But overall, the design was pretty static. It seems like once it was for sure that the M16 was going to go into full adoption. Remember that in 63, it was just supposed to be a interim measure. That took some wind out of their sails, and they just couldn't quite find the foreign markets they had been hoping for. A lot of countries, again, a little bit of foreshadowing, including Japan, got samples and were interested in them, but no real takers. But, well, Armalite decided to turn to the civilian market with the AR-180. This was submitted to the ATF as a semi-automatic only, and approval was obtained around 1968, maybe early 69. And a semi-automatic military-style gun would have been a pretty radical sight on the market in the late 60s, early 70s. Colt had, of course, introduced the SP1, but it really stood alone. The approval was given in 1963 for this version, with production models released in 1964, but because the Vietnam War would be scaling up, they would actually produce them very slowly for the first 5 years or so. You don't really see SP1 production ramp up until around 1970 or 71. That's why the most of them you find are made in the 70s or 80s. Now these, they would start producing them in 1969 at their Costa Mesa facility, and while it was a little better equipped than the old Hollywood one, there was still a lot of hand-fitting, gun bench fittings and smithings, and so production would remain quite low. They would build about 1,200, a little less, select fire AR-18s for military customers, police customers, or keep in mind back then the registry had not been closed yet, so theoretically they could sell them to civilians. And they would also make just over 4,000 AR-180 semi-autos. Unlike this version with the paint finish, they would have a gray phosphate, a gray parkerized finish. Remember, it's steel, not alloys, so no anodizing. But again, they look for a foreign company to really produce for them like AI had done before, and they'd, of course, take a commission to cut. And the first of those would be Howa in Japan, of World War II fame, and they would start producing under license around 1970-71, but this would be a pretty brief run. It was shut down in 1974 by the Japanese government because of their constitution not allowing exportation of firearms to any belligerent country currently in war. And since the U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War, Howa could no longer make under license for Armalite. And they would produce just under 4,000 guns. So they lost their first licensed producer. The Howa guns were quite nicely done. One thing that's widely reported about them is their bayonet lugs are not made to spec, so you can't readily put an M7 on. Something I've observed is their kind of gray-green phosphate seems to have not been applied very well, because when you look at older AR-180s, the Howas, if they've had any use at all, have more finish wear than other versions, Custom Mesa or Sterling's here. And Sterling's, well, this is how I was dipping out. They would start working with Sterling in the UK of SMG fame, 1974. They would sign an agreement, and by 79, production was up and running in the UK. Maybe a little before, but yeah. And Sterling would make the highest number. And they would build about 12,300. Half would have the kind of black Sunkerite inspired finish, and the second half would have a very matte blue finish. Some sources say production would end in 83. Some say 85. We'll go back to that in just a minute. Let's put a pin in it. I do want to mention that Sterling did make a few product improvements besides what Armalite had already done. For one, they would go away from the straight alloy mags to steel mags with a curve. This is a Sterling 20 round steel curved. Better feeding. They also rather famously did a 40 round steel. And note that it has a cutout on this side for 18. And on this side, even if it doesn't have the overstop, over travel, for a 15. So they tried to improve the mag a bit. And they also added larger and more numerous welding points, especially back here at the stock area. May not be as pretty as you'd want, but it's actually a little stronger. But still not the best in the world. But they did try. And flipping it over just again to show you the welds on this side. So they had a bit of a brief run there, but they made the largest number. They even tried making a carbine version and tried some innovations and prototypes, but really they just ended up making the standard AR-180 with very few AR-18s because of the political situation at the time. Back to Armalite in California, after the 18, they did have eventually the AR-100 series prototypes, but that's kind of out of the purview of this video. I will say in the 70s they had very few new designs. They were pretty much just trying to collect royalties on production under their name. Financially, things got pretty tight for them. And in 1983, they ended up selling their assets to a Philippine company. Philippine company. And from there, the name would bounce around for over a decade until it would end up in the hands of Mark Westrom. But that's kind of the end of the original California-based company. That's why I say, on the one hand, I can understand why they could say production at Sterling ended in 83. Certainly their license with Armalite ended then because Armalite no longer existed. But other sources report 85. So I'm wondering if they didn't produce for another year or two after the demise of Armalite, maybe using up leftover parts. This is also the time they switched from the paint finish to the blued, for whatever that's worth. But yeah, the Sterling Armalite actually outlived Armalite, the company. Now, we can't talk about this gun and not mention the IRA. They rather famously used this gun during the Troubles. No one knows how many they had, but a few hundred at least. Now, ironically, they were not Sterling guns. Most likely they were Howa and maybe some Costa Mesa guns. Maybe at the tail end they got a handful of Sterlings, but that seems to be the least likely of the three. Because it was the same guns used over and over and over. You know, one person would use one and be killed or taken to prison, and then someone else would get it, and they were cycled over and over and over. More officially, as you know, I'm sure, this gun inspired a whole new generation. In fact, we've done a couple of videos on it. In Japan, for example, probably because of Howa's production, it led Howa to eventually make the Type 89. And of course, in England, parts of this gun were used, I don't know if this is exactly a claim to fame or something against it, but were used for the SA-80, the L-85. In fact, the bolt carrier system and gas piston are rather familiar to early L-85 designs. And of course, it influenced designs even in Germany with HK and in Italy with Beretta and so on and so forth. I think the AR-18 really brought back the short stroke gas piston as a popular way of doing things. So as I've joked for years and will do forever, yes, it's the Velvet Underground gun because it inspired so much, even if a lot of people didn't give it attention. Back in the U.S., these were just really purchased by civilians and police departments. I mean, that was pretty much it. Normally, I collect military guns, but this one was just so influential and frankly cool that I couldn't resist, and it's really the final design from the original Armalite. Even if Eugene Stunner didn't really have anything to do with it directly. And with that, well, let's go back. As mentioned, Colt introduced to the market the first ever civilian legal, ATF approved, semi-automatic only AR-15 in 1964. Yes, there were some pre-production guns in 63, but those were not commercially available. And the reason they did this, Colt had marketing in mind. You've heard the term CAR-15. The C is actually for Colt. At least it was originally. They literally put their name on the gun. So Colt-Armalite rifle. And they wanted to take advantage of the upper lower to make modular guns, offering conversions, different calibers, different types, different sizes. So it was meant to be a whole family. And the rifle, of course, here, fixed stock 20-inch barrel, would be joined first in 1964 by the Model 605. They literally took a current production 603, so forward assist, E1 lower, and chopped the barrel off in front of the front sight base gas block, including having the 3-prong flash hider. So it went from having a 20-inch barrel to a 15. A tiny number of these were taken, I believe, by the Navy for evaluation, but that was it. This is probably the model you think of when you hear CAR-15. Really, the first step on this road was with the Model 607 in 1965. It had the first 10-inch barrel, and it had the first collapsible buttstock, 2-position. Because of the recoil system, of course, you couldn't have a folder. So basically, they literally just cut down standard handguards, and they even cut down a standard buttstock, making it into a collapser. In the beginning, they used a 3-prong flash hider, but after the beginnings of U.S. government interest in military evaluation, the first moderator was introduced, which was about 3.4 inches long. And this was done to tame flash, recoil, other things. And again, that was with the 10-inch barrel and the carbine length gas system, the 7-inch system that we still use today. So really the genesis was with the 607, or as it was known, the GX58-57. And the Navy SEALs, where they famously acquired about 50 of these. They were all pretty well handmade at Colt, and they tried them out in the Vietnam War early on. But these were never going to be full production guns. After evaluation and improvements, Colt would move to the Model 609, 610 series. And these would retain the 10-inch barrel, originally using the 3.4-inch moderator as well. The 09 had a forward assist, the 10 did not. And these would be the first to have the metal 2-position sliding shoulder stock, and the first to use the round slim style CAR-15 handguards. And the U.S. had need of these and placed a contract order for just over 2,800 at the end of June 1966. And they actually wanted half a dozen of the very, very new 30-round mags for them, but Colt couldn't deliver, meaning that most were shipped with and used with the traditional 20-rounders. This contract would be fulfilled by March of 1967, and then in April, a second contract for a little over 500 pieces would be given to Colt, and this would be fulfilled by September of that same year. And that's actually where this model comes from. These were the new 629 forward assist, 630 no forward assist. Yes, I know some places online claim different numbers. They're wrong. And this had a new improved 11.5-inch barrel. Yeah, an inch and a half always matters, right? But it does give a little more distance and range. Today, with our 1 in 7 twist as a common standard, it would help. Back then, with the 1 in 12 twist, it really helped. So basically, the bullet had one near full rotation. In addition to that, it was done so the XM48 grenade launcher would fit, including with the new Boss back here. And we also have a new 4.3-inch extended moderator as well. And the 629-630 series introduced the now ubiquitous Delta slip ring versus the straight ring, whereas the 609-610 still had the straight ring. A lot of other under the hood changes would take place, although I should say that the carbine buffer used for these actually inspired in some ways the replacement of the Edgewater with the rifle buffer and the rifle as well. So there was a lot of back and forth. So those were the two major contracts. For the military, the X609 was known as the XM177 series. The actual XM177 would be the 610 without the forward assist, and the 609 with the forward assist would be the XM177E1. When it comes time to the 629, this would be the XM177E2. As for the 630, this is where things get a little bit more, because those only went to the Air Force. The Air Force had its own designation system, but no real category for small arms, personal crew arms type thing. Therefore, these carbines get designated under air gun categories. So basically, gun air unit, GAU 5 was its designator, and the original XM177 became the 5A, and the 11.5-inch version became the 5AA. It's weird. So that's probably why there's not another XM designation there, because of the differences. And of course, these were immediately put into service in Southeast Asia, and whenever they could, they did put the extended magazines in them too. And this would also be the time when the XM16E1 was giving way to the true the M16A1, so 67, 68 period. In the Air Force, air guards, security would often get these. Also dog handlers and military police across different branches would get these. The Navy SEALs would get some. I guess they didn't want to keep the GX58, 57, huh? And in the Army, SOG would have some. You saw a lot of Green Berets with them. Also, some guys in just regular patrols would get them. But as you would understand, with under 3,500 in service, they were pretty much a special forces type gun. So as I said, the second contract was delivered by September of 67. But why were no more ordered? The truth is, the military evaluated the new CAR-15, as it started to be known, or the submachine gun under the DoD. According to the Department of Defense, a gun firing a pretty much a small caliber and having a barrel between 8 and 11 inches would be a submachine gun. So this was especially the later version right on the line. But nevertheless, it was classed as that versus a true carbine, or the Commando, as it would start to be known, more as a marketing thing. They evaluated it, and they found some good points. It's quite light, 6 pounds, and it does save you a few inches over the rifle. But once you put on the moderator, the barrel's really not that much shorter, and while the sliding stock is definitely appreciated, it only saves you a few inches as well. And it was just really decided that no new orders should be placed because there just wasn't a huge benefit. And also, with the new election coming up at the end of that year, 1968, it was hoped to kind of de-emphasize the war in Vietnam and try to wrap up the ground war at the very least. So no more large-scale procurements would be made. I'm not going to say they didn't get a handful off-the-shelf purchases from Colt, but that was kind of it. And that's a lot smaller number than you would think for such a famous historic gun. I mean, these were used, be it the GA5A or the XM177E2 in November 1970 on the Sunday prison camp raid, where both Army and Air Force participated. And it's in movies like Platoon, and even to me, it's a very cool, iconic gun. That's why, even though I don't have a ton of retro carbines, I had to have at least an E2. Also in 1970, Colt would actually take the series out of production. One thing that really hurt it, the 1968 Gun Control Act decided to classify the 4.3-inch moderator as a sound suppressor. And yeah, that sucks for Americans, but it also sucked for Colt because it meant exporting them to foreign customers was a lot more difficult and not really worth it. So that kind of limited it. Plus, by 1970, other manufacturers are starting to get into the 223 game. SIG, Beretta, FN, of course, HK. In competition was getting a little stout. The only good thing is 30-round mags started to become more and more available. And it is nice to say that the CAR-15 series did pioneer some advancements that would stick with the design, namely in the handguard. And that was pretty much it, guys, for the 1 in 12, 10, 11-inch guns. They were taken out of production in 1970. Colt would sell off some existing stocks. And for a while, the M16 CAR-15's future was kind of up in the air, especially after the war in Vietnam was officially concluded. So, what next? No, it's not pregnant. So, yeah, I really should have more carbines from this era. But the XM177E2 is kind of it for me. I would love to do a GX5857 build, even though only 50 or 60 were ever made. The 607 style is just cool to me. But not now, anyway. And it uses a lot of very specific parts. I like it, but time and a place. And again, the early carbines are interesting. Even the 608 would be a fun build to do. Even a 605, maybe. Easy enough to do, I suppose. But again, you can go mad. And I like this one. I think Troy did a good job with their XM177E2 for the money. I really considered one of the Colts, but what really bugged me about them, aside from the fact they weren't actually made in Connecticut at the original Pony factory, that I can get over. What bugged me, though, they actually had a 14.5-inch barrel with a permanently affixed slip-over fake moderator. And also, they were just really inconsistent on other markings. The Colts did a really good job with the lower, but barrel markings were very hit or miss. Years ago, I did a video on that. And also the money. They were more than double what the Troys were. Which actually was why I was able to buy this next one here. So with that, let's kind of begin to move away from the first generation and start to transition over to the second with a gun that went through many iterations, changes, throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s. You know how I mentioned that Colt had tried to make a family out of it in a brand name using CAR-15. They did try rebranding from Armalite rifle to Colt automatic rifle, at least in some instances, but it often didn't stick and was changed around and things get confusing. It's the 70s, huzzah. Let's talk about the GU-5P briefly. As I said, the Air Force didn't really have a category for such a gun, so it was in the AU series. Well, eventually they would make kind of a miscellaneous category. They would end up being small arms. The GUU, this would be the 5, and P would stand for personal. So essentially a person's, an airman's, a pilot's, an officer's, what have you, weapon. And aside from a few basic rules, the GU-5P was whatever they wanted, because after Vietnam, the Air Force didn't have as much money, as much funding. They had a limited budget. Therefore, they didn't really have the ability to spend it on AR-15s, carbines. They needed to spend it on, well, planes, bombs, bullets of other types. So they made these out of whatever. Now, as we talked about, the 629 630s were relatively short-lived because of the changing of the rules and export and all that. But Colt, almost by accident, hit upon a very elegant solution. Taking the 11.5-inch barrel, they extended it by 3 inches so that a bayonet would fit. And by doing so, they really corrected a lot of the issues. This would still be during the days of the 1 in 12 twist. And the models would be the 651, 52, 53, and 54. The 51, 52 had a fixed buttstock. The 53, 54 had a sliding adjustable. And you guessed it, with or without forward assist. So these would be 1 in 12 twist guns, pencil, 14.5-inch barrel, otherwise the same as the preceding versions. Of these, really only the 653 was produced in any numbers. Quite a quantity were off-the-shelf purchases by the Air Force and a few other government agencies in the USA. But there were some foreign users as well. Malaysia, who I mentioned at the very beginning back in '59, who had been interested thanks to McDonald's advertising, and the Philippines come to mind, and also Israel, and others besides. So quite a successful carbine, probably the most successful in the series in the 1970s. However, of course, they continued to make the 603 for the U.S. version government, and Colt started doing so-called turnkey factories to produce under license in foreign countries, and they would sometimes slightly customize these. For example, South Korea, what we know today as was Daewoo, now it's S&T Motive, but they had the Korean version known as the 603K, and some other variants, but these are very, very similar to the American for the most part. And that's kind of where things stood. And finally, by the mid-70s, the now today standard size magazine finally started to become available in quantity and number. But going back to 1970, things were a-brewing in NATO. Foreign nations, friendly and not friendly alike, took interest in the new 223 round. Now, like I said, it started off as the 222 Special. It was developed in the 223 to distinguish it from some of the competition, and it was essentially type classified in 1963 with major orders coming. And this is the very first time we see the use of the metric measurement of 5.56, although it wasn't used too much except for some export here and there. Mostly it's still 223 markings on guns. These would be the M193 with the 55 grain bullet. Originally the 1 in 14 twist, then the 1 in 12 because of stabilizing in cold weather, tracers, what have you. And you start to see some foreign interest and foreign production of guns chambered for it. The HK-33 jumps immediately to mind. But NATO decides in 1970 it's going to standardize its second rifle cartridge. Back in 1954, 7.62 NATO, 7.62 by 51, colloquially known as 308, was the first rifle cartridge to be standardized within NATO. And now they're looking for the second small diameter, high velocity, essentially to be used in personal defense guns. You know the deal. And of course, they start with M193 in the US, but actually, it's Fabrique Nationale in Belgium that seems to hit upon the winner. Known in NATO as the SS-109, in the US we think of it as M855. This really went through testing and trials between 1976 and 1979. It was the 62 grain bullet we know and love. It was designed for a little bit longer range, better penetration, at the cost of a little bit of muzzle velocity and also even less tumbling than we already had with the 112 55 grain. And so it was officially type classified and made a NATO standard in late 1980. And with the new bullet weight, a new twist would be needed. 1 and 9 would do, and some nations would use 1 and 9. France comes to mind, Austria comes to mind, Poland would come to mind. But this is often so they can use both 55 grain and 62 grain projectiles. 1 and 7 was really what was needed if you wanted to stabilize tracers and have performance in high altitudes or cold Arctic weather. So the majority of NATO would go with the 1 and 7 twist, and it was considered the standard. So America's going to have to do something. Now, like with the GU-5, because of budgets and everything, the Air Force would simply rebarrel these with the new 1 and 7 twist barrels, usually still having the pencil profile. Sometimes instead of installing just a new barrel, they put on a whole new upper. The only thing that really defined a GU-5 was an adjustable stock. Could be 2, later 4, sometimes even 6 positions were reported. And a 14.5-inch barrel. Now the one on this one is from a 6520, so it's a 16-inch. I even found a few sources that claimed that the Air Force got off the shelf a couple of 16-inch barrels here and there because they were just making do. But in other ways, they recycled whatever they could, using a lot of lowers, retaining this safe single-shot full auto selector, still this 7-inch carbine length system that we know and love. There's no real rules with the GU-5s. This has the so-called Fiberlight stock. Honestly, the first generation of these still had the metal stock like up here. These did not come into service until at least the late 80s. Some sources say even the 90s. Sorry, this one is stiff on this gun. By the way, the slings on these, they're actually repurposed supply bag straps. Because, again, at this point, the commando length, the SMG length, 10-inch, 11.5-inch, whatever, even the 14.5 is not really a standard gun. But while the Air Force kind of made do with reworking what they had, the Army, and especially the Marines, no, they were going to take this opportunity for something new. The Marines really spearheaded efforts. They wanted something, a rifle, that had better range, better penetration to take advantage of the new M855 round and cartridge. They wanted something more dependable, more durable, maybe improve the ergonomics. And beginning in 1980, they started testing and trials. And we ended up with what was originally known as the M16 A1E1. And testing would commence through 1981 into 82 on this design, which was a classic when I was a kid in the 80s. Although today it's quite retro. And at first it looks like just the M16A1, maybe with a different handguard. And the basics are the same. We still have a 20-inch barrel. And we still have carry handle, type receiver, forward assist, all that. But the devil's in the details. A lot of the parts, especially externally, are changed. Let's start with durability. They beefed up the rear of the lower receiver. Notice the dip here, notice the ledge here, and the front pivot pin. Notice how it's very stark here, and then it's slightly stretched out here. Makes perfect sense why. So that was to beef up the metal. The handguards, we went from a triangular style with a dedicated left and right to a round style, essentially an elongated version of the AR15. And these are no longer single use. You can put top on bottom, bottom on top. They're round. You have a heat shield, much more durable. These triangular ones could definitely break teeth on the top very easily. We also went from the straight slip ring to the delta ring first seen on the XM177 series. The pistol grip, we have this hole in the bottom. If you remember back to the AR18, AR180, there was a sling swivel there. That was originally the intention when Armalite / Colt designed this, but it was never utilized. So they got rid of it. They filled it in. That makes sense. The thumb rest on the pistol grip is rather controversial. Some love it, some hate it. It's also a little bit of a fatter grip with more texturing. That's kind of neither here nor there. And then we get to the buttstock. Both have storage compartments for cleaning kits. And there are actually several generations of the updated stock, so this is a later one, but there was an earlier one. But the one thing it was about 3/4 of an inch longer. Did I mention the Marines are spearheading this? Can you tell? Now, I said they both still have a 20-inch barrel, but we have the pencil profile, and we have the heavier profile. Back in late summer of 1980, after some testing and evaluation, they said, if we want to improve accuracy, dependability, going to a heavier profile barrel might help that out. Not a bad suggestion. This was not the answer. What they did, they made it heavier in the front, but they kept the area under the handguard the same diameter so that the M203 grenade launcher would fit. Great, except where it really gets hot around the chamber and even the end of the gas tube aren't really reinforced. Yeah, great, it's a little bit thicker out here. Maybe you won't bend the end of your barrel. But by and large, if you have a heavier barrel, it's heavy towards the chamber and can taper towards the front. Less of a doofy thing was the flash hider. The A1 hider was already an improved bird cage from the 3-prong. Well, now with the A2, we have a solid bottom. This lets it act as a minor muzzle brake. It also, more importantly, keeps the blast from going down and kicking up sand, dirt, what have you. So yeah, that makes more sense. It might not have been quite as effective as a flash hider, but the benefits kind of outweigh everything else. And of course, this would have the new 1-in-7 twist versus the 1-in-12. Moving back again, the port door got a reinforcing kind of bump there to keep it from slapping as hard. Little difference. The forward assist, yes, it's still there, much to owner's dismay. First, it went from the teardrop to a large rounded style, and then soon after to the small rounded. We did get a brass deflector, which is good. A little bit of a nod towards the left-hand or off-hand shooting. And the safety would get a small tick mark on the right. And, at least in theory, could even be reversed. So we see the earliest nods with the M16A1E1 for left-handed use. But of course, probably the biggest thing people notice is the rear sight. We went from one with a 2-position flip peep and a tool required windage wheel here, although you could use a bullet tip in a pinch, to one that is fully elevation and when it's adjustable with knobs, it still has 2 peeps. So quite a fancy rear sight, which actually didn't start off on this version, but we'll get to that in a minute. So I put a bit of a long pin in that one. So those are some of the changes, but another big one was inside. Colt had several versions and models. The 701 was like this, but it had a traditional 3-way selector, safe, single shot / semi-automatic, and full auto, so like the M16 A1. But the version that the US would go with would be the 705. Instead of full auto, it had a 3-round burst mechanism. This was actually something the Marine Corps wanted and was integrated and was controversial. Anyway, it would be the 705 that would be type classified as the M16A2 in 1982. And the Marines would place the first order, receiving their earliest guns in 1983. The Army would actually do some more testing, even looking to perhaps a version with a standardized optic. Keep in mind the Steyr AUG had one. And this would be known as the M16A2E1. But it wouldn't be adopted. Instead, in 1985, the Army would go to it, receiving their first guns in 1986. And the first time the A2 would see combat use would be the invasion of Panama, but it actually would take several years to completely re-equip all 5 branches, with, of course, focus on the Army, the Marines. And part of that had to do with mid-80s budget cuts and changing priorities, so much so that by the time of the 1991 Gulf War, not everyone had received an A2. Some were still with A1s, and especially stateside, National Guard, what have you, a lot of A1s were still knocking about and would be for a long time. But it's in service. Colt would make lots of different models for export and on offer. Some that still had the pencil profile barrel, but still a 1-in-7 twist. Some would have full auto lowers. Some would have 3-round burst. Some would have the A1 sights, or what they called the field sights still. Others would keep the A2. Yeah, brass deflector. Some didn't even have that. You get the idea. One of note was the model 715, which would be adapted by Mishaco up in Canada and produced under license, becoming the Canadian Army's C7. So that's one worth pointing out, and that's a cool variant in and of itself. And other foreign users would have their own variants and versions, but really it was the 705 and the 715 that would see kind of rate production. And by the 1990s, this was the standard. And of course, it wasn't perfect. Like I said, the barrel, that's done a little wonky. The rear sight was more adjustable, but it was also more fiddly, harder to get exactly right. I've heard some, especially Marines, argue that 1 peep is too small, 1 peep is too big. And then, of course, having multiple adjustment points does make it less sturdy. Again, some don't like the thumb rest. Some find the stock too long. And this is roughly a ½ pound heavier with an empty magazine. Even a little more if you go from this size mag to this. Either way, it was the standard. And of course, we had some new equipment come with it as well. We have a more or less standard cleaning kit in the buttstock, although the sight adjustment tool had to be changed for the new A2 front and rear sights. Well, really front sight, I should say. And we had many mag pouches. Although this style here, 3 mags and 2 pockets for grenades, was pretty common in America. Really still is today. I have a bunch of these pouches. I just pulled this one out. I have so many different M16A2 and later M4 era pouches. It's unreal. And we still have the 2-point sling basic But there you go. And a few different blades were made for this version too. Of course, the lug would still support the traditional M7 and often did. And of course, foreign nations often adopted their own types. But this is my M9. It looks pretty cool on the gun. Yeah. That just matches. Saw blade. Much larger knife. Kind of copied from the Russian AKM bayonet. We have the built-in wire cutter. We also have a built-in sharpening stone. And we have much more complicated attachments, even with the QD thing. Again, there's so many variants. We could do a whole video just on bayonets, but I figured, you know, pop the M9 on here because it has a look. I think the only thing that would even be more 80s than this would be with an M203 mounted under it. Because as doofy as I do find the barrel profile, I can't lie. One of these with the 203 on it does scream. Okay, it just reminds me of Predator. I'm not going to lie. 1987, gotta be there for it. So this was the rifle. The SS-109 was the standard NATO round. Some nations would purchase M16s from America. Others would even build them under license. And others would make totally different guns but using this cartridge. And its magazine, if not a full official standard, was a highly recommended thing. The thing about the 30-round mag, though, and the reason it took Colt so long to get it right, is with the 20, it's a straight vertical style because of the magwell. When they went to the 30, they had to put a curve in it, a bend. Now, if you've got like an AK where it's a constant bend for feeding, that's fine. But to have something go from straight to kind of a curve like this, almost like a very gentle V shape, it took them a minute to get the geometry right. And of course, over the years, followers have changed 100 times. And there's all kinds of variations of this mag, and even the previous generation that, again, would be a whole video in itself. So, the M16A2 was the rifle with the 1-in-7 twist for the new round. What about a carbine? Well, for quite a while, there would not be one official style. I will mention that the 653 and similar guns with still the 1-in-12 twist were informally known by and sometimes marketed by Colt as the M16A1 carbine, but this was not a U.S. military, a DoD designation. It was just a Colt marketing thing. What about an M16A2 carbine? Now it's time to bring out my Black Hawk Down carbine, or at least the one I have that's closest to us. This is my Colt LE 6320 with a reproduction retro 4-power brown nose optic on top. Okay, the optic is probably a little early for this, but it was tan, so I put it on. Why not? And at first, this probably looks a lot like that GUU 5P. Colt had several carbine models, beginning with the 720. The 723 was sometimes called the Delta or Delta Force carbine. It was very similar to this. And you also had the 727. And these would be similar but different. They could have field sights, A1 sights like this one does, or later A2 in the version. Some would have the pencil profile barrel, especially early on with the 723, but in time the 727 would have a heavier kind of A2 style out front, but it would have a step down for that 203 launcher, A2 hider, mostly A2 stuff. Of course, we have the 6-hole carbine handguards. This one has the Fiberlight stock on it. And like I said, this one has the still original style sights. kind of similar to the Canadian. By the way, the Colt Model 725 would become the C8 in Canada. And they would even try an 11.5-inch barrel fixed carry handle gun again under the Commando label, the M16A2 Commando, as the 733. So we see them kind of playing around with that. Now, of course, the M16A2 carbine might have a 14.5-inch barrel. This has a 16. That's okay. Everything else is fine. And this is enough of a rare bird that I'm not going to go chopping it down. That would be kind of silly. And just to flip it over, again, standard bayonet lug. This would be able to mount that grenade launcher, like I said. Funny thing is, this is still using the 7-inch gas system. First tried out in the 607 way back when. By the way, the 608 was a unsuccessful aircrew survival gun. Again, the simplified rear. Pretty much the same carbine buffer we've been using for a while, the standard weight buffer. And yeah, this particular one has a 4-position tube because this particular semi-auto was made in the late 90s, early 2000s. So yeah, the early ones would have had a 2-position. And of course, these were made famous by Black Hawk Down because even in the early 90s, 1993, there was still not a standard issue carbine, and these were pretty much just off-the-shelf purchases. But probably the most iconic Colt, at least in a while, is about to be on the horizon. The Colt M4 carbine. And while I wouldn't say its development and early days are exactly a mystery, I would say it's pretty damn convoluted. And it goes all the way back to at least 1982. And you might think, well, it was a direct evolution from Colt's 723, 727. But no. At least not on paper, because Colt is pedantic. Full disclosure, this is an area where you may know more than I do. Probably do. But anyway, we're doing an AR video, so I'm going to give it my go. And I am leaving out some details, and there's other details I'm sure I will forget, and others I just don't know. So let's dive in. The Marines, well, after going to the M16A2 rifle, wanted a short gun, but kind of dropped out because they had no money. The Army picked up the baton in early 1983, and it seems like some of the earliest test guns with the 1-7 twist actually had the 11.5-inch barrel. But really because the 653 had been so popular and successful, the 14.5 was hit upon very quickly that same year. Yes, it could mount a bayonet. Yes, it could mount the grenade launcher. But really, it's just the whole thing. The 14.5-inch barrel just made a lot more sense than the 11.5. And by 1984, it was type classified, at least in some paperwork, as the XM4 carbine. And soon thereafter, the Marines would join the Army, and it would be kind of a joint development. The idea was not as a frontline combat weapon, but as a PDW of sorts, to equip drivers and tank operators, and yes, some airborne units and other special forces. But mainly just a lighter, more maneuverable gun for those with limited space and time. So, what about its name? Why M4? Well, there are two different schools of thought that both say they're right. One, it's a progression from the old M1, M2, M3 carbine series, M1 being the semi-auto only, M2 being the select fire version, and M3 being the nighttime optics version of the good old .30 carbine. However, other sources claim it was because it was meant to replace the M3 grease gun, which itself replaced the M1 and M1A1 Thompson. So was it named after the carbine series or the submachine gun series? Or did it start off as a submachine gun series because it started off as an 11.5-inch gun? But once it went to the 14.5-inch, it kind of got drafted more into the carbine, plus it does say carbine on the side. I don't know. Maybe the Army had one line of thinking and the Marine Corps had another? I don't know. But I wanted to represent both. What about its Colt catalog number, model name? By all indications I've been able to find over the years, that would seem to be 720. 723 is often called the Delta, and 727 was actually a variant technically made for a UAE contract, although both the 723 and 727 saw off-the-shelf purchases and use by Delta Force and others. But 720 seems to be where Colt pigeonholed this throughout its development. And they would work on the gun throughout 1985. However, in 1986, the Army would pull out. Now, they're having some budget issues and what have you, leaving the Marines to go it alone. But by this point, they've started to see the utility of such a gun, plus Navy is interested too. And of course, the Air Force can't keep refurbishing their old guns. That's really where we're at. They've been trying to make the old XM177s work and the few 653s and updating them, upgrading them. But sometimes you just want a new, fresh gun. And there were some new ideas here too. We have the 203 stepped barrel. There are also cuts in the handguard cap for it. A2 flash hider. Rather than having a bottom-mounted sling swivel, we have the side-mounted can that can be flipped to either side. We do see this in some of the M16A1 carbines, or at least a variant of it. These handguards seem to have been a pretty early introduction, but maybe not from the very get-go. The ovular style gives room for 2 heat shields instead of just 1. Of course, we have the A2 grip. One thing that's really critical to this design are the M4 feed ramps. That is a change to both the receiver extension and the receiver itself. This was done during development to improve feeding and reliability. While the early ones could have had 2 position extensions, it seems like most, if not all, production had at least a 4, which is something Colt stuck with. Now, on the other hand, while this is the modern M4 stock with 2 sling points, for the first few years they did use the Fiberlight stock like here. Another point of debate is this carry handle. The 723, 727 had a fixed handle. Your M4 has a removable carry handle on a 1913 Picatinny rail. However, plenty of reports talk about earliest production batches having a fixed A2 style handle. This gets complicated because it's entirely possible they weren't technically 920s, which is what the production M4 would become, but they could have been commercial export models like the 777, which started to have more and more M4 features, even some type of M4 roll mark, especially if they had the feed ramps. It's unclear. The XM4, though, was purchased in kind of small numbers here and there, appearing more and more in the late 80s and early 90s. It wasn't really ready for the first Gulf War, but what really pushed it into the spotlight was Mogadishu in 1993. While some of the M16A2s were considered too unwieldy, too heavy, in the urban environments, those that were lucky enough to have an M16A2 carbine had much better thoughts. So this kind of really got the Army back in full. The Marines were already on board. Long story short, by 93, orders were placed, design and development had been concluded, and in 94, the XM4, the Colt 920, as it's now known, was officially adopted as the M4 carbine. So basically, 720, fixed carry handle, 920, removable with the pick rail underneath. I'm generalizing, you get the drift. These would be safe, semi, 3-round burst guns. The 721 and the 921, on the other hand, would be safe, semi, full auto guns. Colt continues to do this. The stock, like I said, would come a short time later, appearing around 2000, actually entering the field around 2001, 2002 at the beginning of the so-called War on Terror. And we'll talk about other changes. Now, there would be other minor internal improvements over time. By this point, we're starting to see the H-marked buffers, the heavier buffers. We have the later style castle nut now, and some other minor improvements to boot. Colt claimed this had about 80% parts commonality with the M16A2, though. Funny how when they wanted to promote its interoperability, parts commonality, they really drummed up the common traits, but when it came time for patents and claiming ownership of the TDP, then magically the M4 is a completely different gun. Colt, ladies and folks. Colt. I should also point out that these were manufactured not only by Colt, but F.N. Herstal under contract, who had previously manufactured the M16A2 and also some M16A1 barrels. So FN has entered the chat by the 1980s and will become a major player for several decades in U.S. small arms. Now, at this point, this was still meant to be a self-defense gun, not a frontline combat gun. It was meant to replace the aging M3 grease guns, which had served in tanks for decades. In fact, a friend who served in the first Gulf War still had an M3 grease gun that he had to qualify with in his tank. They would retire them shortly when he got back stateside. It also replaced some M9 Berettas and kind of a hodgepodge of older guns. And it let some people carrying the M16A2, which remember had gained some length and weight, get something a little shorter and lighter. This isn't near as light as the XM177, but it's still not a whole lot over 7 pounds completely dry. Again, we have the government profile barrel where it's thin under the handguard, fat out front. Pretty much everything else is A2. And while they decided to go with the 920 in 1993, in 1994, they also would start adopting the 921 in limited numbers, which would become the M4A1. Now, when you think of M4A1, you probably have a certain image in your mind. But in actuality, technically speaking, U.S. military, the only difference, M4, 3-round burst. M4A1, full auto. That's the difference. Now, in practicality, there would be more cosmetic differences and enhancements, but those would come later. Because again, the M16A2 was still the front line rifle. This was just a submachine gun / carbine / pistol replacement. Humble roots in some ways. Either way, by 1995, these start to appear in the field, and their combat debut would be in 1999 in Kosovo. And so, while many operators still have their older M16A2 carbines, having a small standard really let a lot of the older hodgepodge get retired. In fact, if you think about it, the M4 carbine was the first submachine gun or carbine-sized AR15 to ever see full, complete adoption by the U.S. Armed Forces, the Army and the Marines primarily. The Navy did use some for vehicle drivers and security. And the Air Force would be a little behind. They had their GU-5s, but by 2002, they too started receiving new M4 carbines, which by 2006 let them replace most, if not all, of their GU-5s. So by the early 21st century, and the Coast Guard have some too, because if we're going to say all five branches, all five branches. It only took 20, 30 years. I don't know. I found that kind of interesting because you think of carbines as being there, but up until this point, they really were kind of a very protracted, very prolonged development. And then we get the M4, and then it has issues. But they may not be its fault. You know where I'm going with this. Yeah. But before we go there, before we really break into the 21st century, Afghanistan, the Second Iraq War, all the modern fixins, let's backtrack a bit, go to kind of a side channel, and talk about some interesting variants and maybe less successful models. Let's go from a small, lightweight carbine to the opposite of that. And also, remember when I asked you to put a pin in the rear sights from the A2? Well, this next gun is where this sight pattern originated. Colt's model 750, so-called M16 LMG, or automatic rifle. This was the SAW version, the support weapons version, and it didn't just start in the 80s. Actually, Colt had been trying for a automatic focus version since really the very beginning. Going back, we talked about the Colt 605, the 607. I even briefly plugged the 608. What about the 606? Well, that was Colt's first effort at a heavy barrel version. It had triangular handguards, a bipod, and a slightly thicker barrel. But overall, it was only about a pound lighter. Excuse me, pound heavier. Lighter would be a thing. I've been doing this for a while. It really didn't go much of anywhere. They even tried doing a four-way selector, the kind that spins in circles. So, safe, semi, burst, and auto. Next would be the 613. Now this would still be a closed bolt design. Pretty much just like a slightly heavier, M16A1. But its biggest chance would come in the late 70s because, of course, we're going to the new SS109 M855 cartridge. We need a new squad support weapon. So beginning around 1977, running through 79, we have trials, and Colt submits. Based on the previous 606 and 613 and experiences from that, this was the M106, or might have been XM106. Doesn't matter because it lost. It lost to the FN M249. Yeah, that's some stiff competition, I'm not going to lie. But Colt didn't give up. In 1982, they partnered with Mishaco in Canada. I already mentioned the 715, the C7, and the 725, the C8, which of course would evolve both into the C7A1 and C8A1. So we have a connection with Canada. And a couple of designers in Colt's R&D department didn't want to give up on the LMG concept. And between 83 and 85, really, working with Canada, they developed this version here again, the 750. And it was the original trials gun that went up against the 249 that first introduced the windage elevation adjustable rear sight, which is how the Marines were able to call on it 1980-81 for the M16A1 E1 program. It's all connected. And of course, this would also have the reinforced lower receiver. This is a semi only. And so there's a lot of commonalities between the two, but also a lot of differences. Let's begin with the barrel. And this is a H-bar, a true heavy barrel. It's basically an inch up here, little less. And it only gets thicker as you go back, which is partially why we have these wonderfully rectangular boxy handguards. That part is mostly cooling. We even have an extra thick gas tube in there, and this folding handle and foregrip are actually mounted together, not on the handguard, but actually to the barrel directly. And so the handguard goes around those. That's great until you start shooting it a lot, and then this metal gets really warm right here. Luckily, the plastic's still pretty cool, and this down here is cool. And yeah, now the earliest grips were kind of a slanted style, but soon they would go to this vertical post style. And then coming back, of course, we had a almost standard lower, and it could use standard mags, but that really wasn't what it was designed for. They played around with the proprietary snail, or whatever you'd like to call it, mag, but soon they would go to a somewhat more standard mag we know today. That seems a little more appropriate. Notice that there is no forward assist, but we do have a case deflector, brass deflector, and actually, of course, this is a semi-automatic lower anyway, so it's still 2 positions, but even the military version was 2 positions, but it wasn't safe and semi. It was just safe and fully automatic. That is because this was an open bolt gun. And that actually required quite a few changes in the lower, because basically when you pulled the trigger, it released the bolt rather than releasing a hammer directly. You can look up drawings online. For one, that's not really what I specialize in. For another, this is YouTube, so gotta be mindful of what we can do here. But yeah, check it out. There's plenty of videos. I'm sure Small Arms Solutions has one showing diagrams. If not, they've got to be out there. It's very fascinating though. But no forward assist. Going back forward, the earliest bipods were repurposed M60, and then later they would go to a proprietary bipod. Of course, the legs on this particular one are adjustable. We have a standard A2 flash hider and a very beefy coupler up front. Everything about this is beefy, that's for sure. And then, of course, we have a standard M16 A2 buttstock. Now, as I mentioned when I showed my standard A2, there are variations of this stock, and this is one of them. This has the more gentle checkering on the butt plate, and it's in all metal versus the polymer. It's just different production eras. Flipping it over, not much to see. No sling swivel on the bottom. I just kind of ad hoc put a sling here. You know my rule about slings. And as you can see, this is on a more or less period correct, late 80s, early 90s Colt semi-lower. But that's about when these were put into production. One more neat feature is the buffer. Up until this point, our rifle buffers went from the Edgewater to the standard, but this has the hydraulic buffer. This was done for recoil and fire rate reasons, and a lot of people I've talked to have never shot one of these in semi-auto with the hydraulic buffer. And I will say, it's pretty nice. It actually makes it a very soft system to shoot. But it still has the cleaning kit in the stock. It's a drop-in part. I will say that it also requires a special spring to go with the hydraulic buffer. I was just lucky enough to get this as a complete kit, sans the full auto lower. So that's the M16 LMG, the 750. They would contract with Demeco in Canada for these to be produced up there, which means this has a wonderful Demeco cold hammer forged, chrome lined 1-in-7 twist barrel, very high quality barrel, and these were in production by 1988, and they didn't go anywhere, unfortunately. It was looked at by several nations, but ultimately, the Cold War was ending and times were changing. However, the 750 would evolve into the 950, known as the LSW, light support weapon. It had a flat top, 1913 rail. It actually was closed bolt. It had a bayonet lug for some reason. And it was actually selected, I believe, it was on offer by 2001, and I believe by 2003 it was selected by Denmark. Yeah. But not AI for making it. Now, these were made in Canada for them. And the production run would run through about 2008 for their military. And they still, as far as I know, supply and refurbish their LSWs to this very day. I should also point out that in 2005, Colt USA purchased Colt, which was Demeco at the time, making it Colt Canada up in the north. So the last ones would still be made in Canada, but would be under the Colt Canada brand name. So even though the 750 itself wasn't really successful, it had limited success with its kind of updated flat top version, closed bolt version, as the 950. So yeah, M16, LMG, SAW, automatic rifle, SAW. Of course, in the U.S., the closest we'd see to this would be the M27 used by the Marine Corps. Yes, Colt did submit an IAR for trials, but lost out to HK. But that's kind of a story down the road. But yeah, I think it's a cool gun. Had to bring it out for this here video. We were at little 5.56 carbine, then big 5.56 rifle. Now we're at little 9mm with the Colt 9mm SMG, or at least a semi-automatic version with an original upper. This really started development around the same time, 1982, and initially hit the market in 1985. This version was marketed as the model, or at least row 635, and it had a 10.5-inch barrel, an A1 style flash hider, but bored out for 9mm, sling swivel, car 15 handguards, pretty much a standard A1 pattern upper, but it's a slick side. We have this large deflector, but it's not really a brass deflector. It's plastic, by the way. This was a gas deflector, and because of it, we have a shortened port door. You notice it's just really cut off. That's okay, though, because 9x19 is, in fact, shorter than 5.56 by 45. Now, the rear sight, while it is, A1 style, the sights are adjusted for 50 or 100 meter 2 positions, again with a windage adjustable wheel. And originally it would have had a standard old school castle nut in 2-position extension with a heavy buffer. Now, in the very beginning, it did not have a spacer, which caused problems, especially with the bolt slamming forward on the catch. So a spacer was put in so it would not over travel. This one has a A2 style grip, which was more or less the standard at the time. And as I'm sure you know, these were closed bolt. Colt's R&D department, yes, they actually had one at one time, did first look at an open bolt version, but for safety reasons and accuracy reasons, they soon switched over to a closed bolt during the design phase, prototype phase. And now this is not a Colt blower, because Colt has never offered a semi-automatic 9mm AR15 or AR9 if you prefer. Pistol. Great, Colt. Leaving money on the table. What's new? That's okay, though. The reason I went with the Rock River is it uses the original mags made for Colt by Metalform. Now, some people find these difficult to load. I never have. There were a few generations of these, and there's the longer version here and then the shorter. And if it looks a lot like an Uzi mag, really it was inspired by them. But notice it doesn't have the over travel stops like an Uzi, and it has this ridge in the back. Now, early Uzi mags also had this, but for this mag, it's necessary to work with the last round holdback device. And of course, the cutout's in a different location. Double stack, double fade. Now, again, some have issues loading these. I've never found them difficult, but if you do, I actually really like this Maglula loader here. It's even an OEM product that ships with some of the Colt police guns. You literally put a round in and you just rock it back and forth. It even locks onto your mag so it won't come off. It even has a handy dandy lanyard ring on the bottom. So if you have issues, pick all these up. They're pretty cool. They even compact down and fit in your mag pouch. And for the pouch, I have a lot of these. This is a South African pouch. I got a bunch of these from Vector back when they were in business. They sent me one or two, and I told them, I really like these. So a while later, they just sent me more. Most I gave away to friends and customers, but I hung on to 3 or 4 for myself. It's a very nice little pouch. It's got 4 tall pockets in the back, and then kind of a large dump pocket, and then a small pocket that's perfect for the mag loader. It also has a handy dandy shoulder strap and also belt loops. These are made primarily for the Uzi, but they'll work with almost any SMG mag because they're so loose and handy. Like some women I know. So as you'd imagine, in the 80s, while the Uzi was on the market, it was getting a little long in the tooth. Colt's competition mostly came from the MP5 and MP5K. Sometimes the HK would win, but more than you'd expect, the Colt here would win. Part of it was that you do have standard AR controls, layout familiarity, but also they were a little cheaper, and they were made here in America, which made them attractive for some police departments. And in some ways, they were at least as accurate. And they were pretty dependable, although I would argue the design was never perfected as such. But it was pretty good. In fact, it was good enough that the Marine Corps adopted it. Simply known as the 9mm SMG, the Marines picked these up in the late 80s, using them for a while, security and whatnot. I could imagine the Navy SEALs had some too, but I don't know. They would have originally had a 2-position telescoping stock. As far as I know, it was the Fiberlight. Some early ones might have had the metal stock, but I think by the time these came out, the Fiberlight was coming around. And the very earliest production ones didn't even have this deflector, but they pretty quickly decided, yeah, we need a gas deflector, because this direct blowback system could gas you up pretty good, especially if you wanted to attach a suppressor. But they did pretty well, all things considered, and Colt would make them for a number of years. But that's, of course, the Select Fire version. You had the 635, which was safe semi-full, and you had the 639, which was safe semi 3-round burst. Pretty much the same. Of course, the bolt is special. They did have to go to stronger stainless steel fire control group pins, especially the hammer pin, just because of the wear and tear with the direct blowback bolt slamming into the hammer and everything. So that's a small difference. And the bolt catch, the bolt release, is of course modified to work with the magazines and the magwell. While Colt never made a 9mm AR pistol, they did release a 9mm AR carbine as early as 1987, known as the 6450. Essentially, it was the same as the military version, of course, with safe semi only, and we had a 16-inch barrel instead of 10.5, and of course the same flash hider here. This one has no bayo lug. Some I've seen do, some don't. It did come from a police department, so it shouldn't be a band style. It does have the deflector. Notice the cut down port door. Forward pin. And it has a 2-position Fiberlight stock. Not 4, and certainly not 6. So it goes to show you what they were kind of doing at that time. So this is my original. And this has the magwell here. It's actually in a standard lower, but with an insert pinned in. So they drill holes and install roll pins. Early on, this was a single piece affair that was kind of linked together with bridges. But very quickly, that was determined not to be the best design, so they went to the 2-piece, a front and a back. However, in 2001, they would actually go back to a single piece that was an updated, improved design. So they've kind of gone with this magwell insert. Unfortunately, you just can't drop one in as such. Like I said, they had to be pinned in, so you need holes. But it at least allowed them to use the same lower, the same forgings. Notice the pins on this side. And as I'm sure you notice, there's no forward assist, again, because it was a simple blowback gun. Pretty standard. Because this was a semi-auto from that era, even though we have the small front takedown pin, the .250, this is the transitional where you have the single-sided screw. You know, the SP1 originally had the enlarged .320 with the double dildo screw. And then, of course, after this came out, they would get rid of it and go to the simple, you know, front style like on this gun here, you know, the one you know and love. What's interesting about this pattern is, even though it has the screw, the other side actually has the fence. But it's not drilled out, you can tell, because it doesn't have the small relief cut, the small hole, the drain hole. Because if it did, I would swap them out. I've actually done that before on some transitional 6520 carbines. So yeah, these were manufactured and sold on the civilian market through at least 1992. But then Colt started doing more and more band styles, including a fixed stock and eventually getting rid of the flash hider. These would be known as the 6430, 6430. Of course, when the assault weapons band came in, that's when they had to get rid of all evil features. This would be the MT 6430. Now, they would introduce the 6450 unmolested for the police and civilian market at the end of 2004, beginning of 2005, when the ban came off. And that would last for some time until it would finally be replaced by the 6951 around 2010, 2012. The 6951 is essentially a modernized version. M4 handguards, flat top upper, M4 stock, you know the deal. And of course, it had a corresponding military police version in the 991 and 992. Again, full auto versus 3-round burst modes. So officially, they still make these, although it seems like it's been a while since they've done a run of 6951s. But they really look like M4 carbines, but they take the 9mm mags. So yeah, a few police departments, a few military foreign users adopted the 635, with the biggest user in America famously being the U.S. Marine Corps, which is neat. It's a pretty neat little gun. It really is. Quite small with this underfoot long barrel. But 10.5 inches is rather long for 9mm. You really don't need all that length. What if you needed a 9mm SMG, but it needed to fit into something like, say, a suitcase? If you know, you know. The Colt 633, nicknamed, even informally named, the DOE carbine or submachine gun, Department of Energy. And this really was made especially for them as a subcompact version here. In the rear, it's the same gun, with perhaps the only difference being the buffer. While some had the heavy buffer of the SMG, some also came with a hydraulic buffer, somewhat like we saw in the LMG, but smaller. Same magazines, the difference being in the front. We have a short two-piece synthetic handguard. Actually, this was more or less borrowed from the port firing gun. We have essentially a standard barrel cut down from 10.5 inches to just at 7 inches. I have seen a variant that's threaded. This seems to have a slightly longer barrel, because as you see here, at 7 inches, this really doesn't stick out far enough to reliably mount a flash hider, and definitely not enough for a sound suppressor. And we have this very interesting metal front cap, again, kind of port gun inspired, and pretty unique. We have a folding front sight base post, which is kind of special to this gun. The original 635 is not big and not heavy. It's under 6 pounds. But this thing, especially when you collapse in the stock, or in this case, arm brace, is quite tiny. At least it was by the standards of the 80s. And it's very light. 5.5 pounds, even lighter. And that was the idea. This was used by the Department of Energy for transport defense, and really for defense in nuclear power plants, because 9mm doesn't have the risk of penetration like some other rounds might. Also, fun fact, they had the new company Armalite AR10Bs and 16-inch 308s. Those were not used in nuclear power plants. They were used for like convoy defense, which is actually a big deal in the DOE. I know a bit about the DOE just because of my gunsmith, but anyway, I shouldn't say any more just in case, because he's still current with them. But interesting stories that can come out of those guys. And this was their little briefcase gun. And at 7 inches, you're still getting some pretty good oomph at a 9mm. Its major competition was the MP5K, which had about a 4.5-inch barrel, or in some cases the MP5K PDW, which had about a 5.8-inch barrel. So still more than an inch, pretty good. And you still get the same common controls. The only other agency that purchased these in any numbers was the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, but they acquired a few hundred, whereas the DOE acquired a couple of thousand. And a few other police departments picked them up. I think maybe it was New Orleans had some, a few other little things. But this was a very boutique item, the 633. Colt made under 5,000, whereas they made considerably more. 633s and all its variants. Again, they're still technically in production today, but these haven't been made since late 80s, maybe early 90s. I really don't know. Details on their production and use are very, very slim. I have this because a few years ago, some uppers hit the surplus market, and I nabbed one. I could have put it on any lower, but most of your 9mm AR lowers take Glock mags, and if you're going to do a DOE, it's got to have the right metal form, straight stick mag in it. If you're going to do this, do it right. Of course, the brace is just an acquiescence to modernity. Maybe one day I'll SBR this lower, get an SBR Colt lower, so I can use both of these. But I like swapping back and forth, but most of the time my Rock River lower has the DOE on it because, I mean, yeah, this is neat, but it looks like a pretty well standard AR. This just has a look to it that's, well, you don't see a lot of them. It's a lot of fun too, and it's more reliable than you might think. Unlike with a gas system gun, since it's just direct blowback, having a short barrel really doesn't hurt reliability that much. I'm not going to say the 9mm was a huge success for Colt, and at certain times they themselves haven't seemed too interested in it. However, it's been a side project for a number of years, and it's a thing. It exists. And it kind of rolls us from the retro era nicely into what we can consider the modern era. So post 2001, post the beginning of War on Terror, and kind of the beginning of rails. So you might consider the second generation here the 1 and 7 twist generation, from the M16A2 through the M16A2 carbine and commando variants, which bled directly into the XM4 and the early versions from 94, 95. And we start to see the beginnings of the Picatinny rail upper, but still we have the polymer handguards and often have the removable carry handle. But as I said, switching from generation 2 to 3 is when rails and accessories become the norm. Of course, they had always been around even since the 60s, but they were pretty uncommon, really, for special forces and that kind of thing. But after 9/11, the beginning of the Afghanistan war, and then, of course, the second Iraq war, changing needs, changing times, well, we need rails to attach things. Lots of things. All right, back to the M16A2 and the M4. One thing I wanted to point out real quick, it's entirely possible to have the M4 marking on an upper receiver, because that indicates the cuts for the M4 extension feed ramp, and not have an F marked front sight base, because the F marked front sight base is meant to correspond with the 1913 rail, specifically the carry handle or other similar height optic mounted on it, because obviously having this rail means it's slightly higher than without. So you could have one of the early XM4s or M4 marked guns like the 777 or 779 Colt models with the A2 style upper, but M4 cut mark here, and then a non-F marked front sight base. A little pedantic, but I'm told you sighted people really do prefer it when your sights actually line up and hit a target. But yeah, let's move on. So we had the A2 adopted in 82 by the Marines, 85 by the Army, and you had the M4 adopted in 94 by the Army. And the Marines did purchase some of these, but not many. They mostly stuck to either pistols, submachine guns, or they decided they'd rather stick with a rifle. They preferred its longer range, additional handguard space, accuracy, marksmanship. It's the Marine Corps. So yeah, while the M4 made headway with the Army, and then by the early 21st century, the Air Force too, the Marines, well, take a lot longer. Instead, Colt worked on a version for them. Essentially, what they did, they took the M16A2, but they swapped out the fixed carry handle A2 upper for the M4 style, sometimes called an A3 movable carry handle upper with Picatinny rail, and presented the Marines with the M16A4. Now, in military parlance, there was an M16A3, most purchased by the Navy, and that was simply an M16A2, but rather than having the safe semi-burst, the M16A3 had safe semi-auto. It would have been a Colt Model 701 or whatever equivalent. So with the M16A4, this was known as the 905 for the burst mode version. 901 would have had the automatic instead of burst. As far as I know, the Marines mostly rolled with the 905 though here. Testing was underway. Colt first introduced this in 1997. It's kind of a complement to the new M4, and the Marines officially adopted it in 1998 and would start re-equipping over the next few years. According to the Marine Corps, testing in the early 21st century revealed that the M16A4 had 1/3 the jam rate of the M4 carbine of the day and time. And they did a lot of testing between 2001 and 2006 to kind of prove this. They also liked its range. They preferred the fixed buttstock. They preferred the longer forearm. And really the trade-off was weight. This is a pretty heavy gun, and it got even heavier as it came kitted out. When Colt first started shipping these, they had the standard A2 style handguard and a removable carry handle. Then they would introduce a version closer to this here. We would have the Knights Armament rail handguard with removable rail covers, and instead of having a carry handle, we would have a backup sight from Maytech. This would become known as the M16A4 MWS, Modular Weapons System, and you started to see these appearing again in the early 21st century based on experiences first in Afghanistan and then especially in Iraq. And now, of course, this is an Colt AR15A4, and over the years I've done my best to set it up in a kind of early 21st century style. And yeah, kitted up like this, it is not lightweight, but it's pretty cool. This is not 100% clone correct. For one thing, the Colt upper has M4 cuts. The real M16A4 did not. But for the semi-auto, why not use the same parts? And they certainly don't hurt anything. I've never noticed any issues with reliability. This side mag pouch for a spare mag is actually surplus straight from over there. I picked it up years ago. The ACOG, the TA-31, is close to the right version. It's like not quite the right sub version, but yeah, by the year 2001, 2002, they started using these, and the Marines would actually purchase these in large quantities by 2004, 2005 for these and a few other guns. We've got a light, pretty common. We've got the ANPAC 2 laser designator on here with 2 different emitters. These entered into service in the same kind of time period and are still used today, although they're being replaced by newer versions. Pretty typical Knights Armament broom handle foregrip, which I actually like. And then kind of your standard Harris bipod. Still has a bayonet lug, standard A2 flash hider. This is a standard profile barrel, therefore it is skinny. Under the handguards, it's a government profile. Again, it's very, very similar to an A2, just, yeah, with lots of gobbledygook put on. And here's the other side. You note that it does have the ambidextrous safety. That became more and more common and even a factory part as time went on, as militaries around the world decided that lefties were in fact not directly descended from Satan. And yeah, cleaning kit in the stock, pretty well standard gun. And the Marines really like these for a while. I never have been able to find an exact number of how many they picked up, and I don't believe the Army obtained many at all. Maybe the Navy had a few to replace some older guns, but this was, by and large, a Marine Corps weapon, and it shows. But as time went on, its shortcomings, or rather longcomings, became more and more apparent. Around 2012-2013, the Marines started authorizing use of adjustable collapsible buttstocks on these for shorter stature personnel or people just wearing thick clothing or body armor. And this became very much a standard by 2014. And they had to admit that it was a little heavy. Kitted out like this, you're 10 pounds. Even without a lot of the kit, you're still 9 pounds with the Knights Armament handguard and whatnot on here. And of course it is long, about 39.5 inches versus around 33 for an M4 carbine, depending on the exact variant. They also had to admit the Knights Armament handguard system wasn't always the newest, latest, and greatest. I still like it. It's a very durable, very tough, but you know, it doesn't have a textured grip. It's kind of proprietary on its rail panels. I understand it. It's, you know. So there were some that didn't like the size, the weight, and just times were changing. Now in 2015, the Marines finally authorized the switch from the M16A4 to the M4, reserving the A4 for just personnel that needed it, or training stateside, what have you. The idea was now officers under the rank of colonel would carry an M4 carbine rather than just an M9, M9A1 pistol. At this point, all the submachine guns are long gone. But even this was kind of short-lived. They were hoping to have it implemented by the end of 2016, beginning of 2017, because they actually had quite a few M4 carbines in their inventory. So it would just be kind of pulling in some guns and reissuing others. But then the HK 416 or the M27 came around, and instead of that, the decision was made in 2016 to essentially re-equip a majority of Marines with it. That left the M4 is kind of a specialist gun, maybe carried by an NCO, a leader, vehicle drivers, because it still was lighter and a bit shorter than the M27. But the point is, the M4 really, really never gained a foothold with the Marine Corps. Not like it did others. Namely, of course, the U.S. Army. And the M4 story really is fascinating. So we'll try to have a bit of an abridged version. The M4A1 story is really the story of how a defensive logistical carbine was transformed into a frontline standard issue battle rifle. And it actually begins before the M4's official adoption. Back in 91, 92, SOCOM was using some M16A2 carbines with full auto rather than burst mode. Fast forward, they would actually purchase some Colt 921s designated as M4A1 and they would get these by 1995, 96 in this time frame. But we're still on SOCOM, Special Forces in the Army, so on and so forth. And the first ones looked identical to this. They had the government profile barrel, came with the polymer handguard, removable carry handle. The only difference was the auto marking instead of 3-round burst on the lower in the beginning. But of course, this would not last too much longer. By the year 2005 in the Army, most of the older M16A2s had been cycled out of frontline service, taken back to the States for training, reserve use, and the M4 carbine, the Colt Model 920, was king. But what about the Colt Model 921, the M4A1? The configuration we're more familiar with when we think of M4A1, and probably a gun you know more about than I do, for sure. Anyway, we're having fun. That's all that matters. At least I hope you are. I am. By 2001, 2002, SOCOM and a few other Special Forces units started purchasing the Colt Model 921 HB. No awards for guesses for what HB stood for. Heavy barrel. Finally, they got rid of the skinny profile under the handguards, going to a mostly thick profile. We still have the step down here, and we have the flats under the handguard so that the 203 or other units could be attached. But finally, we're having the heavy barrel start to appear and be purchased. So while most M4A1s have the heavy barrel today, if not all, it's not actually part and parcel with the designation. The selector switch really is. As far as accessories, this kind of mirrored the M16A4, having, of course, the carbine length version of the Knight's Armament handguard with the broom handle. These could be issued with the ACOG, which actually the Army had been issuing since at least the late 80s to some. But I've got an aim point on it. EOTechs were also a thing. Maytech rear sight. While a lot, especially early on, had the standard M4 stock, I really do like the LMT SOP mod stock, or its B5 equivalent, which was produced under license. We still have a 4-position extension, and we have the H2 buffer. Typically, if you have a heavy barrel, you go to the H2 buffer. If you have a government profile, H buffer. Of course, this still has a 14.5 inch. We have a Surefire flash suppressor with the ability to mount a sound suppressor, side sling mount, standard bayonet lug. I have mine pretty straight down. And in the early 21st century, a lot of your metal mags started being replaced with polymer mags, most famously by Magpul. And flipping it over, notice the ambidextrous safety. This actually would come in as part of the PIP, the Product Improvement Program. It would eventually also suggest the heavy barrel. We'll get there in a minute. But yeah, the Army really started emphasizing the M4 with Special Forces, focusing on the M4A1. And then in 2009, the U.S. government, the Army, essentially obtained full rights to the M4 from Colt. In 2010, they would purchase around 12,000 M4A1s, factory-built guns, and these would be in service by 2012, mostly with Special Forces, but a few spilling over to more regular units by this point. 2011, they would purchase over 75,000 M4 to M4A1 conversion kits, and these converted guns would start appearing in service a couple of years later. And the idea in 2012 was they were going to purchase 120,000 M4A1s, with the first batch made by Remington and then the subsequent batches made jointly by Remington and Colt. I find it hilarious because Colt pitched a fit, so it went to court, the contract was pulled. Then Colt's claims were tossed out, and the contract was renewed for 120,000, but it went to FN. So Colt got nothing. Instead of getting a piece of the original pie, they got nothing. Now, FN, of course, had been making the M16A2, and would make the M4 and now the M4A1 under contract using the TDP. It helped that the government essentially owned it, but there's still a bunch of back and forth and using the TDP for other things. It doesn't matter. Regardless, the point is major contracts for the M4A1. So after this time, more and more just regular soldiers are getting the M4A1 with the product improvements. The safety selector, the heavy barrel, the forearm appears, and there were ideas to go to an improved and enhanced bolt group, a few other little changes, but in 2016 it was decided, you know what, this package here, as you see it, it's good enough. It does the job. It's cost effective. We've got them. It works for us. So that pretty much was the end of really future development. We used to think of this as a Block 1 or Block 1.5, with the Block 2 having more of the monolithic rail system. And it went from being in the SOP mod and SOCOM arena to a standard issue gun because of its frontline service. And while yes, early on the M4 had issues, they were mostly because it was being employed in ways it was never really intended for. But once they gave it the right barrel, it really helped because a lot of the failure points had to do with heat buildup in that area. And extra material really did help. Also, tightening down quality control, production. Some of the defects could be traced to just manufacturing oopsies. Colt, don't you know? Yeah, this was in service hundreds of thousands. Of course, in 2022, it was announced that the XM5, the M5, now the XM7, M7 would replace it. I'm still skeptical about the whole SIG thing, but that's a story for a whole different video. This to me is still kind of the current issue type gun. Again, I've kept mine pretty simple, pretty stripped down. In reality, you should have some lights and lasers on the forearm, maybe a flip magnifier too, but I like it this way. Gonna be honest, it's still pretty heavy. It's 8-ish pounds, maybe even a little more with the optic on. So, bit of a far cry from the days of under 6 pounds with the old Vietnam era carbines, I'm not gonna lie. But still one of my favorite to take out to the range. And then it is a Colt, so there's that. So, M16A4, M4A1, those are our standards, but we still have a few specialist guns to talk about before we can wrap this here video up. Moving from the now standard M4A1 to the still a little bit specialized Mark 18. And this is a Mark 18 Mod 1. But before the 1, there was a 0. And this actually goes all the way back to the early 90s in the initial SOP mod kit that was being put together for, well, SOCOM, Special Forces operators, and Navy, and everyone else who needed one, SEALs. And it integrated a lot of aiming, targeting components, sights, suppressors, grips, pretty much the kitchen sink. And the idea was you would have interchangeable receivers, and the shorty would be known as the CQB-R, so Close Quarters Battle Receiver. But this would actually be dropped. And in 1999, 2000, the receiver would end up becoming its own little carbine, really thanks to the Naval Warfare Center Crane, who actually was the initial developer of the SOP mod stock, again produced by LMT, at least after the first ones were made by Crane in-house and had issues. Contracted out to B5 as well. And that would have been the stock that should be on this if it, well, was an SBR. But anywho, the Mod 0, the Mark 18 Mod 0, was kind of a custom-built gun. The earliest ones had cut-down carry handle rear sights, a standard post front, and they could be made from a few different ways. A lot of the early ones were actually rebuilt using old M16A1 guns, so they'll have remarked lowers. Some were Colt M4, M4A1s that had their barrels cut from 14.5 down to 10.5 inches. Others were either barrels or complete uppers purchased from Lewis Machine and Tool, LMT, with 10.5 inch barrels. But Colt, they didn't want to do the shorter barrel. They had been doing the 933, the M4 Commando, with an 11.5 inch barrel, and they really, really pushed for this. But eventually they acquiesced, and Colt started offering either a receiver or a complete gun, eventually from the factory, with a 10.5 inch barrel known as the 933 CQB. Also, after the first generation or two, the barrel length was standardized not at 10.5 inches, but at actually 10.3, which is the standard till today. And as time goes on, the cut down guns are kind of being phased out, and we see factory built guns coming around. And then in 2005, Daniel Defense got involved, and we would end up with the Mark 18 Mod 1, with the big difference being this handguard system and a Mark 12 low profile gas block. So essentially, the difference is more rails. The Mod 0 often had the CAC, but it had the fixed front sight. Again, the Mod 0 was little more than a 3-inch shorter, 4-inch shorter, M4 carbine. And then the Mod 1 introduces more things, and this is still all integrated into SOP Mod Special Forces. Navy SEALs definitely use them, thanks to Crane, but the Army got some too, quite a few. Green Berets, Delta Force, Rangers, some airborne units, commandos, protection duty units that could use something small. One cool use in the Navy is boarding parties, for ship-to-ship boarding, which makes a lot of sense because this gun's under 30 inches with stock deployed, so it's quite small. And Crane would remain involved from the beginning to really present day. We have the ambi selector. This is, of course, the Daniel Defense Mark 18 pistol. They often had Knight's Armament flash suppressors with the ability to mount a suppressor, a sound suppressor, silencer. You would see a lot of LMT, Knight's Armament parts. These often had aim points or EOTechs on them, although some did have ACOGs or LCANs magnified. I put fixed iron sights on mine just for fun. That's actually a recent thing I did. I don't know. I had a set. I threw them on. Why not? A QD sling swivel. So this one's added to the lower receiver. This one has it here. This one has a bit of an ergo grip and enlarged trigger guard. Hey. But the Mark 18 Mod 1 is very common today. It's even kind of trickled out of Special Forces, SOCOM a bit. It has definitely grown beyond the SOP Mod receiver plan it originally started off with in the 90s. And they built well over 10,000 now. And it's a pretty iconic U.S. service little commando thing. As far as I know, Colt still does offer the 933 CQB, as they call the 10.3 inch carbine, SBR, submachine gun, whatever you'd like to call it. And I just stuck a short mag in it. Thought it looked kind of nice. Got a enhanced charging handle on it too, just because. But yeah, what was the thing? Oh yeah, the insides of these. One thing learned over the decades, gas port sizes. Something that if Colt had really known about, thought about, researched in the 60s, might have saved some of their early carbines. But either way, the Mark 18 has an enlarged gas port, because we have very little dwell time here. It also has an enhanced bolt group. We have an extra power extractor spring. We have the O-ring there. The gas ring is often upgraded as well. And as for the receiver extension, this can either have a 4 or a 6 position. And of course, this being a pistol, it's got an arm brace on it, but the military guns could have CAR 15, Fiberlight stocks, M4 stocks, or the SOP mod stock, or maybe even something else, because these are very user configurable. Inside, usually you'll have an H2 buffer, sometimes depending on the ammo, an H buffer, and rarely an H3 buffer, but this is usually in case of guns that have seen a lot of rounds and just need the extra oomph behind. So yeah, we do have a modified bolt group. We have not exactly an enhanced buffer, but H2 is more or less the standard here. And the enlarged gas port. And that's just to give reliability. And the current Mark 18s really are reliable. When they first started off, not gonna lie, they were a little finicky. But yeah, over the years they've gotten a lot better. And they've seen a lot of military service. But it is still a specialist gun. But not quite as specialized as our next offering. It's time to talk about the GAL 5A. But not this GAU 5A, but this GAU 5A. Honestly, one of the coolest little guns that I picked up in the last few years. And one of the newest U.S. military issues, specifically done by the Air Force, also known as the ASDW, Aircrew Self-Defense Weapon. And this one's made by Midwest as a replica, but the real ones are assembled in-house by the Air Force, although they do use some Midwest parts, including the handguard. And this is not meant to be a main combat gun. This is meant to help with the downed aircrew. The idea is that if they're shot down, they don't have to rely on the M9 pistol. They really hadn't had a rifle or carbine since the old M4, M6 that we looked at the very beginning of this video. See, it's symmetrical. It's like poetry. It rhymes. But they really needed one after events in Iraq, Syria, what happened to a couple of Russian pilots that had been downed. The idea was this could reach out to nearly 300 meters and could hold off enemy combatants for 2 to 4 hours until help could hopefully come. To that end, the military version is safe semi 3-round burst. Of course, the civilian version is just safe semi. And it's pretty neat. Now, these were first announced, at least the need for such a thing, in 2016. In 2017, an interim solution was created, again, in-house at the Air Force. They took some old GAU 5/A's, maybe some GUU 5P's too, and they chopped the barrel down right in front of the sight base. That gave them an 8-inch barrel, so they were small enough to fit in the ACES 2 survival kit, which measures about 16 inches by 14 inches by 4 inches. And so it would fit in there, but extremely loud, extremely flashy, concussion, and of course, 0 dwell time. And they're using old guns. But this was just an interim stopgap solution. The next year, 2018, they would announce the new GU 5A, no slash, ASDW. And these would first enter service in spring of 2019, first equipping frontline combat units, namely fighters like the F-22 and F-15E Strike Eagle. After that, they would get over to the F-16, the F-15C Eagle, and then the A-10 and B-1, B, the B-2, and even some old B-52s. Frontline combat. The initial order was for just over 2,100. And again, work could be done in-house by the Air Force in Texas, actually. And they would use old GU-5Ps and M4 carbines, basically for their upper and their lower. And they would rework them. Now, they would still have the standard buttstock, CAR 15 or M4, 4-position tube. That's all pretty normal. But where it gets interesting, it's up here. We have a Cry Havoc QD barrel system, Midwest handguard. We have a 12.5-inch barrel made by BCM. And the idea was, yeah, they could have gone a little shorter and still fit in the ACE kit, but they wanted to give as much range, much accuracy as possible while still fitting in there. So 12.5 inches plus the flash hider was pretty much what they could do. And we had MBUS Pro metal flip sights as standard. And these were packed in with 4 30-round mags, 120 cartridges in them. And the mags were actually not Magpul. They seemed to be metal. Either the new FDE ones, which I have some around here. I just could not find the pouch that has them. I've looked and looked. I'm sure I'll find them right after doing this video. So, of course, you collapse in the stock, or in this case, arm brace to fit in the kit. And it also comes standard with this Fab Arms folding pistol grip. Fun thing is, the pistol grip still has a little storage compartment in it, too. I added a little electrical tape for mine so it wouldn't rattle, but it's fine. So that compacts it up. But, of course, the big deal is the QD barrel system. Simply pull these back, one on each side, and remove barrel. So yeah, pulls right off, and in this package, it's just about 15 inches long each section. That way it securely fits in the kit. The kit also, of course, contains other survival gear, some basic medicine, a little bit of rations, clean water, flares, and other survival gear. The whole kit weighs like 40 pounds, so this is a small component of it. It's actually amazing how much they cram in one for as small as they really are. Now, I've done a full video in the past about this, and some people wonder why they didn't just use a Mark 18. Well, for one, you have over 2 inches of extra barrel. And for another, if you separate a Mark 18 upper and lower, you have, exposed lower guts in your kit. Your hammer and everything, even your bolts exposed. And in a kit, that's fine, but what if something jams in there? The point is, trying to put an upper on a lower when you're at home or at the range, easy peasy. But this needed to be something that could be assembled quickly, because a pilot could be either disoriented or straight out wounded, have a rough landing, or he could find himself immediately under attack. So they wanted to make this as simple to assemble as possible, and it can essentially be done one-handed in case, his other hand is wounded, otherwise inoperable. And also your internals are more protected. Yeah, your bolt face is exposed here, but other than that, your hammer and all that's protected. Yeah, your chamber is exposed, your receiver extension, but other than that, then that's at the end of the kit, and they can be covered up. And then you just deploy your grip and sights, and you're ready to go. Slap a mag in it. It makes perfect sense. Plus, I think they just want to do something cool and different. Seems logical to me. What do you think? It's a lot of fun to shoot, too. Yep, and there's back together. The only thing I will say, if you pop these, there's this little key here. Make sure that's out of the way when you go to disassemble, and make sure it's laid over when you go to reassemble. Doing that, very easy to do. And I put a fair number of rounds through this over the last 3 years, and the barrel still fits fine. Accuracy is good. It's from Midwest, so I'm not worried about, rigidity. These did pass military testing, military trials. Now, again, they're not meant to be a frontline gun, much like the M4, M6, even the original Armalite AR5. This is a survival gun, but unlike those, which are just meant for small game hunting or defense, this is meant to hunt the most dangerous game, or rather defend against the most dangerous game hunting you. Just thought I mentioned that, which is why it does fire 5.56 NATO with proper M855 spec or similar. So they planned on converting several of these a week. I don't know how many they're up to now. A couple of years have gone by, but they were meant for frontline. The Air National Guard was going to use FN made carbines with 10.5-inch barrels. Is again a bit of a non-frontline substitute for a while. I'm sure they still have some. So there is basically a Mark 18 survival gun, also in Air Force service, but for the frontline guys, the ones who are actually in combat, they get the slightly longer ranged and frankly really cool ASDW. Standard A2 flash hider, and low profile gas block. Standard port door. Yeah. Ambi safety. Low profile though. I do like this folding grip. I do. As far as I remember, this has a standard. It's either, I think it's an H buffer in here. I don't think it's a standard mark. It's either a standard or an H, but I could have looked before the video, but oh well, I didn't. And that, folks, is my most recent U.S. government, U.S. Armed Forces service AR-15, M16, CAR-15, M4 type gun. And back here once more. You know, I enjoyed these guns, but there's only so many ARs I can do. I'm only really interested in the military guns and more into the historic guns. As I said with the 60s carbines, I would like to do a GX 5857. And when it comes to these, I think a fun one for a foreign version would be one of the Israeli guns, one of their 12.5-inch guns. Kind of interesting. I would also not mind having a Mark 12, but it's hard for me to put that kind of money into something that I can't shoot for accuracy, so kind of practicality gets in the way there. And I've had a Mark 18 Motto before, but I thought the Dango Defense was neat. I picked it up when the black version came out. Something I'd kind of wanted for a while. And the Midwest was a bit of a impulse thing, but I don't regret it at all. The Colt M4A1, the 6920 SOCOM, is really just about perfect. The AR-15A4 Colt did was a good base rifle, and it was priced very well, and it took me the better part of a decade to really accessorize it, mostly with surplus parts, used parts that I acquired or traded for cheaply, slowly kind of piecing it together. The 6320 was police surplus from CD&N some years ago, and while I could have built a Black Hawk Down style carbine, I thought it would be more interesting to have essentially the closest factory semi-auto that Colt offered. When it came to my M16A2 though, even though it's on an AR-15A4 lower, I did get a complete upper that's Colt, put it on a lower, because when you look at the guns that Colt offered in the 80s and early 90s before the 94 assault weapons ban, something was always not quite right. Either they would be H-bar, or they would have the large pivot pin being on a slab side lower, or they'd have the A2 lower, but it'd still have the style like you saw in the M16 LMG. A lot of them didn't have the bayonet lug. There was always something just not quite M16A2, and if I was going to have an A2, I really wanted it to be exact as best I could. I've had a lot of fun, but you really can go crazy especially if you do the off-the-shelf, the COTS purchase guns like the 653 and the 723, the 727. And if you're getting that detail-oriented, it gets more and more difficult. That's actually one reason I did not keep the Brownell's E1. As nice as it was as a gun, things like having the flashing style, still on the FSB bugged me. Not having the proper barrel markings bugged me. Because if you're going to do a clone, it needs to be clone correct. Otherwise, but your mileage may vary. And there's a lot more I could say about Colts and things, but that's what previous videos are for. That was just kind of an overview of the U.S. service guns. While I know I don't have them all and never will, I feel like we have a good representation of the first through the third generation here. But there is a certain fourth generation, although not necessarily in U.S. service, but I'm not quite ready to be done yet. Let's have a little bit of bonus content before we wrap things up. How does that sound to you? Good? If you could, though, as I remind you at the beginning, please do like, share, subscribe, and check out Patreon if you haven't. Maybe you can vote on the next big deep dive video and other stuff. Even though this video is on U.S. service ARs, you gotta have a couple of bonus ones here. And to be fair, this is at least made in America, even if it is made for Estonia. The R20 Rahe, R-A-H-E, made by LMT, Lewis Machine and Tool, now Defense, under contract. I really do enjoy this gun. This is, of course, the 5.56 version, semi-auto only. The military would be select fire. This is a gas piston gun with a single position regulator. It has the 14.3 inch barrel with a pin and welded flash hider that's suppressor compatible, but these really aren't intended to be used with suppressors. For that, another version was purchased, the R20S, which has a 12.2 inch barrel, and it has a 2-position gas regulator, so one for the suppressor. Of course, this is a short stroke piston. It's part of the MARS, Modular Ambidextrous Rifle System, L for light program piston version. They also, of course, have the direct impingement. It is truly ambi. All the controls are mirrored on the other side. LMT considers this a 4th generation M16 M4 type, and I would agree, although many more changes, and it would be hard-pressed to call it an AR because of the gas system, but also the monolithic upper. We have an over 14-inch continuous top rail, all of a piece. We have 2 bolts that hold the barrel in. It's actually relatively quick removable with the tool, and it's supposed to return to 0. Pretty heavy profile barrel, M-LOK compatible forearm. LMT Gen 2 pistol grip, which really reminds me of what Wilson Combats used for 20 years. And the Estonians ordered it with the slim Magpul stock here. And they even use the Holosun sight and magnifier combo. And then we have LMT's flip back sights. And of course, one thing that sets the R20 reference rifle apart from the standard Mars L's is a Stanag compatible bayo lug. And this is some pretty sharp Italian steel. Fits quite nicely. Of course, LMT started way back in the 80s, but didn't really start scoring military contracts until the 21st century as they innovated, offering direct impingement or internal piston if you prefer, or external short-stroke piston systems, modular uppers, and really doing a great job of ambidexterity. And Now they serve nearly 50 nations in some capacity, some to the military. And in 2016, the Estonian Defense Force announced it needed a new standardized battle rifle, assault rifle type family to replace kind of a hodgepodge that they were using. They had a couple of different Galils, ARMs, SARs that they'd picked up in the early 90s from Israel, some HK G36s, some old Swedish AK4s, maybe a handful of German G3s too, some MP5s, some MP7s, which were pretty new still at the time. They had some G36s that their special forces were using. They even had some old M14s and some other things. You get the idea. Hodgepodge, new gun. So trials began in 2017 and ran through 2018. Over a dozen companies submitted designs to try to meet what Estonia wanted, which was essentially a cost-effective, and they weren't just talking about, the initial cost, but long-term. Is it going to be cheaper to buy this in a decade or not? Serviceability. So dependability, ease of maintenance, not requiring a lot of replacement parts, that kind of thing was important to them. Plus, of course, accuracy and the ability to operate in several environments and what have you. And, as common with NATO as they could. HK, Sig Sauer. By the way, they also had some HK 416s because they had a little bit of everything. Several American companies submitted designs. LMT was announced as the winner in relatively early 2019, and they initially ordered 19,000 of these, but with an option to purchase more through 2026, and that does seem like they have exercised that option because more than 20,000 have been delivered by now. I think around 25,000, give or take. Most in the R20 configuration, but not an insignificant number in the R20S. And thanks to this barrel system, switching between the two configurations is simple as can be. Doesn't even really require gunsmithing as such. Now, one reason they went with the Holosun optics was because they spent so much on the rifle. Obviously, they got a better deal than you or I would just buying a couple from them. But because they wanted something that would last a long time, they kind of adopted a buy once, cry once attitude for the R20 rifle. When it came to the optics, though, they did kind of have a good enough attitude. Let's get these Holosuns for now. If they break or wear out, we can buy more later or something better later. Not a bad financial decision, frankly, because optics are a wear part as much as none of us want them to be. Things happen, especially in service. And standard Magpul PMag with them. The reference rifle comes with this Vickers sling, QD mounts. I like these rubber covers on the M-LOK. I really do find this a great feeling gun, and it's true ambidexterity. So they started receiving these in 2020 with the first batch delivered by 2021, and then by 2022 they had enough to re-equip the first 6,000 or so frontline. Special Forces got some. Finally, on that point, you had border security, even some police, parts of the Ministry of Defense, and Judiciary got some. And this would basically let them retire their aging Galils, and of course some of the old AK-4s, and a few other guns. Of course, newer guns like the MP7 and even the G36 will still stick around. But this is the preeminent gun, and this was the first time they really designed something for their needs. And it was really thanks to the fact that LMT was willing to configure however a customer wanted within reason. Their catalog is pretty extensive. It even has the European style safety where it can be put on safe even when the hammer is not cocked. Something that's not a big deal really, but if you look at a lot of European guns like the MR556/HK416, it's there. But a lot of American guns even today, if your hammer's not cocked, you can't put your safety on. Anyway, really well built gun, but not so overbuilt in precision that it doesn't serve in a military capacity. And yeah, they're going to have support logistics for these for decades to come. And who knows, they may buy more. And since they have a border with Russia, they probably felt it was actually good timing to make sure their frontline infantry had a very dependable and standard weapon. Not that I'm saying anything would happen. They are a NATO member, so yeah. Sometimes I wonder about the people in charge all around the world. But yeah, no, LMT has really shot ahead in the last 20, even 15 years. As I mentioned, they made some parts for the Mark 18 project. They've made other things for the U.S. military, especially with the SOP mod kits and things, the buttstocks. But the Estonian contract here was a pretty big coup for them. But it wasn't the only one, or even the first military that they won. Even though this rifle is actually earlier than the R20, hey, we began with an AR10 type. Let's end with one. LMTs, well, commercially LM308, internationally LM7. To the British, the L129A1 sharpshooter's rifle, or just sharpshooter. This is another reference rifle, although to be fair, the British version 2 just has a safe semi with a match target 4-pound trigger, firing 7.62 NATO. While it can use sniper grade ammo from the get-go, they insisted it be able to use just regular L2A2 Radway green, feeding from SR20 mags. I think they definitely use the 20 round versus the 25, although it can take a 25. 16-inch stainless steel barrel, about a 1 in 11.25 twist, surefire 3-prong flash hider, LMT sights, although the earliest versions had Knight's armament, SOP mod style buttstock. Again, that ergo pistol grip. This has an earlier version. This isn't the full ambidextrous lower. This is the MWS from LMT. But it still has the removable barrel system. We have rails with rail covers instead of M-lock. Yeah, you can tell it's a little bit of an earlier design. And flipping over to the other side, we have a brass deflector, case deflector, no forward assist, so Stoner would be happy. It's marked sharpshooter, standard port door, ambidextrous safety. And yeah, very interesting and one of LMT's first big contract wins. The sharpshooter came out of an urgent request for a rifle in 2009 from the British Ministry of Defense work in Afghanistan. Their current sniper weapon was a DMR at the time. They were also using some L86s and a de facto DMR roll, but it didn't really work out. They had some old L1A1s around, but that was really too dated. They wanted something much more modern. So they said, hey, we need this. They gave out specs, and by December of that year, they had picked the LMT LM7, again the export version, and essentially it's an off-the-shelf purchase. There are a couple of customizations that appear in the design. For example, it has a 16-inch barrel, but LMT over the years has offered 13, 16, 18, and even 20 inches, and because of the quick change system, they're all compatible. The first of these would enter combat in late spring of 2010. The first order was for about 450, but many more would be ordered. Now thousands are in British service, and the plan has always been to issue one per squad, one per 8 men, to kind of reach out, touch someone 800 meters. Even though it's a safe semi-only gun, it was also meant as a secondary role as kind of a combat weapon, a battle rifle, hence why replacing a bolt action. And it's been quite successful over there. Now mine here, I've kind of just set it up with what I had. This is a knockoff Chinese Harris bipod, although the original does use a 6-9, so this is the right size. And the optic, well, this should have an ACOG on it with an RMR. That's with the British issue. I'm not paying that, sorry. I can't use it, so I'm not paying for it. So I just threw this on. It'll do the job. And it's actually pretty close to what New Zealand uses. In 2014, kind of seeing the success, they too adopted the 7.62 NATO LMT. Is a more of a battle rifle DMR sharp gun too. Theirs in New Zealand was safe, semi full auto. They used a more of a magnified optic than the British. I believe it was from Leupold. And it's actually the New Zealand version that has the folding foregrip. The British version, not as much. Funny thing about the British version too, they spec'd out the Surefire flash hider that's suppressor compatible, but they really weren't intending on using a sound suppressor on these. They just wanted that compatibility, plus they just like the flash hiding capability of the Surefire device. And after, I guess, being quite successful in New Zealand in 2016, they won another contract, this time with their Mars L, similar to the Rahi we just looked at, but it was the direct impingement version, and that was to replace New Zealand's aging Steyr AUGs, Australia, the F88. So that was a pretty big coup, and the LMT does offer a reference rifle version of that, but I kind of prefer the Estonian for a couple of reasons that are just mine. But I did think having a modern AR10 type. Now, as I said at the very, very beginning of the video, modern AR10s are essentially upscaled AR15s. Not really the same pattern as the 1950s AR10. I say that because of the bolts, the trigger groups, everything. But nevertheless, having an AR-style rifle in 308 7.62 NATO is pretty neat. And if you're going to get one, it's difficult to build one using parts from here and there and do it yourself, because these are a little more fidgety than, say, an AR-15. And there isn't the universal parts commonality. So that's one reason I went with just a factory put-together gun versus trying to do a build. Something I tried to convince Fox of, and he didn't listen and has had quite a bit of issue with his AR-10 adventures, but oh well, live and learn. I've done it too in the past, so it's just how it is. But yeah, I think this will satisfy well. Now if I can ever get out and shoot it. It's been packed up several times to go shooting, and for one reason or another had to be canceled. Rain, snow, J-Ro getting a job and couldn't drive me that day. But we will get it out one day or another, and I am very much looking forward to it. And now we do come to the end. I just had to pop those LMTs in here. Yes, I did consider the Taiwanese T91. You know, it's a gun I really enjoy too, but that's too much of a story. And the fact that I didn't really bring in other guns kind of should tell you that there's the makings for another deep dive video there. So, hadn't forgot about them. But after doing the bullpup video, I wanted to show the more traditional AR some love. But what do you think? What's your favorite look? Do you like the 60s look, rifle carbine? Do you like the 80s look? Or maybe you do like the modern 21st century rails look. Let me know. And likewise, what generation do you really not like? Kind of curious. I will say all my life I've found quality built ARs to be reliable and dependable. Their jamminess is greatly overstated and often results from people either using poor magazines or poor ammo, or just having a gun that's kind of cobbled together, or a bargain basement gun that was not made to anything close to spec. That's not to say that a cheap gun can't work. Many do. But that's kind of the problem when you go cheap, is you skip out on some of the quality control. So out of 10 guns, 8 might run perfect and 2 might have issues. I should add another FN to the collection. I had a FN military collector series for a while. They make good guns. The FNs do. But at least mine aren't completely all Colts. And yeah, I could have gone into more magazine variants, mag pouches, more bayonets, but again, video's long enough as it is. But maybe I'll do an addendum. And I didn't put shooting footage in the video, even though I considered it, because, you know, you put this much time and effort into something, you kind of want it to stand the test of time on YouTube, so tried to be as conscientious about that as I could. But anyway, appreciate you hanging out today. Love to hear what your favorite and even least favorite AR. What do you think compared to the Kalashnikov, the FAL, the bullpups we recently looked at? Let me know. This is Misha, and a cat that is decidedly not pregnant. She just seems like someone put an air hose in her butt and kept pumping. We'll catch you very soon next time.